Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where we take the long way around to the things that matter, the quiet roads, the overlooked corners, the places that have been sitting with their questions long before anyone thought to write them down. There is something about valleys that mountains do not have. A mountain holds its strangeness up high, visible, almost proud of it. But a valley keeps things close to the ground. It collects. Water drains into it, sediment settles into it, and over long enough stretches of time, stories pool there too, layered like geology, one account pressing down on the one before it. Some valleys are just geography. And then there are places like the one we are spending time with tonight. Tonight we're going to the San Luis Valley, southern Colorado, edging into northern New Mexico. A place that, depending on who you ask, is either one of the most beautiful and overlooked landscapes in the American West, or one of the strangest places on the continent, or both of those things at exactly the same time. Before we go any further, where are you tonight? I am genuinely curious. Are you in bed with the lights off, somewhere cold and quiet? Maybe you are driving a long stretch of highway, or you're sitting in a room where the rest of the house has gone to sleep. Whatever the hour is, whatever the temperature is outside your window right now, I hope this is a comfortable place to settle in for a while, because we have a lot of ground to cover and we're going to take our time with it. If you're new here, welcome. If you have been with us before, it is good to have you back. If this kind of slow, careful storytelling is something you enjoy, a like on this video helps more people find their way here, and subscribing means you will be around for the next one. It takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely matters. Thank you, really. Now, the San Luis Valley. Let's start with the shape of it. Because the shape is already a little strange. The valley runs roughly 122 miles from north to south, and about 74 miles across at its widest point. That is not a small valley. That is a space large enough to hold the entire state of Connecticut and still have room left over. The floor sits at around 7,500 feet above sea level, which means you're already in high country before you've driven anywhere interesting. The air is thinner up there, the sky is bigger. At that elevation, on a clear night, the stars are not a backdrop, they are the whole ceiling. On the eastern side of the valley, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rise sharply. Not gradually, sharply, the way a wall rises, with very little transition between the flat valley floor and the sudden vertical climb of the range. These peaks push past 14,000 feet in several places. On the western side, the San Juan Mountains form the other wall, older and more rounded but no less dramatic. So what you have is this enormous flat basin, maybe 9,000 square miles of it, pressed between two major mountain ranges on either side. The valley floor itself is largely treeless. Sagebrush, grass, agricultural fields in the northern sections. In winter, it can look almost lunar. In summer, the heat rising off the flats creates mirages that shimmer and drift. Either way, the flatness is the thing you notice first. It is almost too flat, too open, too exposed. And then, sitting right at the base of the Sangre de Cristo range, there are the great sand dunes. If you have never seen them and you are picturing a modest pile of sand at the foot of a mountain, let me correct that image. The great sand dunes are the tallest dunes in North America. The highest point, Star Dune, reaches about 750 feet above the surrounding valley floor. 750 feet. That is taller than many skyscrapers, and they are sitting there at the base of a 14,000-foot mountain range, in the middle of a high-altitude desert basin, in a place that receives less than 8 inches of rain per year. The visual does not compute the first time you see it. Your brain keeps trying to place it somewhere that makes more sense. The Sahara, maybe, or the Arabian Peninsula. And it keeps failing, because this is Colorado, and the Rocky Mountains are right there, and none of it should look like this. The dunes are not a geological accident exactly. There is a real explanation for how they got there, and we will get to that. But even knowing the explanation, standing in front of them feels like standing in front of something that has not quite finished being impossible. That quality, the feeling of something that has not quite finished being impossible, turns out to be something the San Luis Valley produces in a lot of different contexts, not just geological ones. The valley has accumulated over the course of several centuries of recorded history and thousands of years before that, a density of unexplained reports that is genuinely unusual. Not unusual the way a place with one famous ghost story is unusual. Unusual in the sense that the reports come from multiple independent categories. Lights in the sky, animal deaths with no clear cause, creature sightings, geological anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, disappearances, and a persistent sense among people who live there that the valley operates by rules that are slightly different from everywhere else. Some researchers who have spent years cataloguing these reports have estimated that the San Luis Valley has produced more documented anomalous events per square mile than almost anywhere else in the continental United States. Whether you find that exciting or deeply unsettling probably says something about you, but either way, it is a claim worth taking seriously enough to examine. And examining it carefully is exactly what we're going to do. Not with the goal of proving that something supernatural is happening in the valley, and not with the goal of dismissing everything as misidentification and folklore. The goal is to look at what is actually there. The geology, the history, the documented cases, the scientific investigations, the indigenous accounts, the rancher stories, the government files, and try to understand why this particular piece of ground has attracted so much strangeness for so long. The San Luis Valley is not a place that gives easy answers, it is a place that gives better questions, and on a quiet night, that is exactly what you want. The valley sits in a part of the American West that does not always get the attention it deserves. Southern Colorado and northern New Mexico are not the first places most people picture when they think about the American landscape. Yellowstone gets the geysers, the Grand Canyon gets the postcards. The Pacific Coast gets the road trips, the San Luis Valley gets the potatoes. It actually produces a significant portion of the US potato crop, which is one of those facts that feels slightly surreal, given everything else we're about to discuss. And it gets the quiet. But the quiet, it turns out, is not emptiness. It is more like the quiet of a room where someone has just left and has not quite finished leaving. There is a presence to it. People who have driven across the valley floor at night, no other headlights visible for 20 miles in any direction, often describe a feeling they struggle to name. Not fear exactly, not peace exactly. Something in between. A sense of being watched maybe, or a sense of being very small under a very large sky, which is not the same thing but can feel similar at 2 a.m. The valley has been accumulating that feeling for a long time, long before the first European expedition passed through in the late 16th century, long before the Spanish priests named the mountains to the east, long before the first cattle ranchers fenced off the grasslands, or the first investigators arrived with cameras and notebooks and theories. The valley was strange before anyone was writing anything down about it, and the people who lived there knew it. That is where we will really begin, with the ground itself, and with what the ground is actually doing, because the geology of the San Luis Valley is not background information. It is not just context. It is in some ways the whole story. The valley is not simply a flat place between mountains. It is a place where the earth is actively pulling itself apart, where water hides in enormous quantities beneath a desert surface, where the physics of wind and sand and mountain walls conspire to build something that should not exist. Understanding what the valley is made of and what it is doing helps make sense of almost everything else that follows, so settle in. The night is long and the valley is wide, and there is a great deal worth paying attention to. The great sand dunes are a good place to keep in mind as we go. That image of 750-foot dunes pressed against a mountain wall, pale and enormous and quietly wrong in a way that is also quietly magnificent. They are a useful anchor, because the San Luis Valley, it turns out, is full of things that should not be there, doing things that should not be happening, in ways that have been drawing human attention for about as long as humans have been in the area, which, as we will see, is quite a long time indeed. The story of this valley is not one story. It is many stories laid on top of each other, the way sediment layers in a basin, each one pressing down on the one before it. There are geological stories, and indigenous stories, and colonial stories, and ranching stories, and government investigation stories, and scientific stories, and stories that do not fit neatly into any of those categories. We are going to work through all of them, carefully, without rushing, and try to understand what kind of place the San Luis Valley actually is. Not what it is supposed to be, not what any particular theory needs it to be, but what it actually is, as best as anyone can tell. And what it actually is from the very first look is a place that does not behave quite the way you expect a place to behave. That begins underground. Beneath that flat, exposed, seemingly simple valley floor, there is something remarkable happening, something that geophysicists have been studying for decades and that still holds genuine surprises. The valley is not just sitting there, it is moving. Slowly, measurably, in ways that matter enormously for everything that happens above the surface. That is where we are going next. The Rio Grande Rift is not a household name, but it probably should be. Most people are familiar with the idea of tectonic rifts in an abstract way, the East African Rift, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, places where the Earth's crust is being stretched and pulled apart at geological timescales. What fewer people realise is that one of the most significant active rift zones in North America runs right through the American Southwest, and the San Luis Valley sits directly on top of it. The rift extends roughly from central Colorado, all the way down through New Mexico and into the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico, a long tear in the continental crust that has been widening for somewhere between 25 and 30 million years. In the San Luis Valley, the effects of that process are not subtle, at least not once you know what you're looking at. The valley floor is sinking. That is the plain way to say it. The crust beneath the valley is being pulled apart by the same forces that are slowly widening the rift, and as it stretches, the central block drops downward, while the mountain ranges on either side are pushed upward. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east and the San Juan Mountains to the west are not simply mountains that happen to be near a valley. They are the edges of the rift, rising as the valley floor descends between them. The technical term for this kind of structure is a graben, a block of crust that has dropped between two parallel fault systems, and the San Luis Valley is one of the largest and deepest grabens in North America. The valley floor you see when you drive through, that flat expanse at roughly 7,500 feet elevation, is not the actual bottom of the basin. It is the top of an enormous accumulation of sediment that has been filling the graben for millions of years. The true bedrock floor of the basin beneath all that sediment sits somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 feet below the surface in the deepest parts. That is 5 to 6 miles of sediment beneath your feet. It is a staggering number to sit with for a moment. This is not simply a geological curiosity. The depth and structure of the basin, the way it has been filling with sediment from the eroding mountains around it, the way water flows into it from all directions and largely stays. All of this creates conditions that are genuinely unusual in ways that have measurable effects on the surface environment. And the first and most dramatic of those effects is the water. Beneath the San Luis Valley, hidden under that dry, exposed, semi-arid floor, there is an enormous amount of water. The valley contains one of the largest confined aquifer systems in the entire western United States. Estimates of the total water stored in the valley's aquifer system vary, but figures around 2 billion acre-feet have been cited, an almost incomprehensible volume. To put that in some kind of perspective, 1 acre-foot of water is roughly 326,000 gallons, enough to supply a typical American household for about a year, 2 billion of those, sitting under a desert. The aquifer is not a single underground lake, but rather a layered system. An unconfined upper aquifer that interacts with the surface relatively freely, and a deeper confined aquifer, sometimes called the Baca aquifer, that is sealed beneath a layer of impermeable clay and volcanic material. The confined aquifer is under pressure. In some locations, if you drill down to it, the water will rise on its own, sometimes all the way to the surface. These are called artesian conditions, and they have been known to surprise people who did not expect to find water rising from the ground in what looks like dry country. The Baca Aquifer in particular has a complicated history, because it sits primarily beneath the Baca Grande Ranch, that vast private landholding in the northern part of the valley. For decades, the water rights associated with that aquifer were the subject of intense legal and political dispute, because whoever controlled the Baca Grande land effectively controlled access to an enormous freshwater resource in an increasingly water-scarce region. The ranch changed hands multiple times over the 20th century, eventually becoming a national preserve in 2000 after a lengthy public effort. But the water is still there, still under pressure, still doing what confined aquifers do, holding its position in the dark beneath a landscape that gives no obvious indication of its presence. The closed hydrology of the valley is one of its most quietly remarkable features. Water enters the San Luis Valley from all directions, snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristos, snowmelt from the San Juans, rainfall, springs, but the valley has no outlet river that connects to the ocean. The Rio Grande flows through the valley, which sounds like it should be an outlet, but the Rio Grande actually enters the valley from the north, collects water as it moves south, and exits through a gorge near the New Mexico border. The river is more of a drainage channel within the basin than a true outlet in the hydrological sense. The rest of the water that does not make it into the Rio Grande, sinks. It percolates down through the sandy valley floor and into the aquifer system, where it has been accumulating for a very long time. Some of that water, hydrologists believe, has been down there for thousands of years. There is something quietly astonishing about that. Ancient water sitting in the dark beneath a valley that looks almost barren from above. The great sand dunes, that landmark that anchors the valley visually and emotionally, are themselves a product of this closed hydrological system and the specific wind patterns it creates. Sand is carried by the prevailing southwest winds across the valley floor, sand eroded from the mountains and deposited across the basin over millennia. When those winds hit the mountain wall of the Sangre de Cristos, they are forced upward, and they lose their carrying capacity. The sand drops. But there is more going on than just wind. Counterwinds coming down from the mountain passes push back against the prevailing flow, creating a zone of competing air currents right at the base of the mountains. The sand gets trapped between them, piling higher and higher over thousands of years, unable to go over the mountains and unable to retreat far back into the valley. The result is the tallest dune field in North America, 750 feet at its highest point, covering roughly 30 square miles, sitting at the base of a 14,000-foot mountain range. It looks like something from a different continent, maybe a different planet, and that feeling is not entirely wrong. The dunes exist because of a very specific combination of factors that would not produce this result almost anywhere else. Medano Creek runs along the eastern edge of the dune field, between the sand and the mountains, and it behaves in a way that stops most first-time visitors in their tracks. The creek displays what is called surge flow, a rhythmic pulsing of the water, like waves, every 20 to 30 seconds caused by sand dams that build up in the stream bed and then collapse, releasing a surge of water downstream before the cycle repeats. It is not violent or dramatic, it is gentle and strange, like the creek is breathing. People have described it as looking supernatural, and in a certain light, at a certain time of day, that is not an unreasonable first impression. It is actually a well-understood physical process, but well understood does not mean common. Surge flow like this is rare enough that Medano Creek is one of the few places in the world where you can reliably observe it. What all of this geology produces, beyond the visible strangeness of dunes and pulsing creeks, is a set of subsurface conditions that have real effects on the electromagnetic and acoustic environment of the valley. The deep sediment fill of the graben, the enormous volume of water in the aquifer, the active faulting along the rift margins, these things interact in ways that are still being studied. The USGS has documented magnetic anomalies in the valley floor, areas where the local magnetic field deviates from what you would expect based on the regional geology. Some of these anomalies correspond to known volcanic features. There has been significant volcanic activity in the region, including the eruptions that created the San Luis Hills and the Taos Plateau volcanic field to the south. Others are less easily explained. Geophysicists working in the valley have noted that the sediment layers, with their varying water content and mineral composition, create a complex and somewhat unpredictable electromagnetic environment. The rift itself is still active, not in a way that produces dramatic earthquakes on a regular basis. The San Luis Valley is not the San Andreas Fault, but in a way that generates a steady background of microseismic activity, small movements and adjustments along the fault systems that border the valley. These movements can produce infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that are below the threshold of human hearing, but not below the threshold of human experience. Infrasound at certain frequencies can cause feelings of unease, a sense of being watched, mild visual disturbances, and in some cases more intense perceptual effects. This is not fringe science. It is documented and studied. The researcher Vic Tandy, working in the UK in the late 1990s, demonstrated that infrasound at around 18.98 Hz could produce visual disturbances and feelings of presence in a laboratory environment. Whether the San Luis Valley produces infrasound at these frequencies consistently enough to account for any significant portion of the reported experiences, there is genuinely unknown. But the physical mechanism exists, and the valley's geology is the kind that could plausibly generate it. There is also the matter of the valley's shape. A basin this large and this flat, surrounded by mountain walls on multiple sides, acts as a natural resonance chamber for both sound and electromagnetic energy. Sound behaves differently in the valley than it does in open terrain. Atmospheric inversions, temperature layers that form when cold air pools on the valley floor beneath warmer air above, can bend light in ways that produce convincing optical effects. A distant light source, refracted through an inversion layer, can appear to move, change colour, or seem much closer than it actually is. The valley's extreme temperature swings, sometimes 60 degrees Fahrenheit or more in a single day, make inversion layers a frequent occurrence. This does not explain everything, but it explains more than most people who come to the valley looking for the supernatural are usually willing to credit. What the geology ultimately gives you is a place that is physically unusual in several compounding ways simultaneously. The ground is sinking, the mountains are rising. There is an ocean of ancient water hidden beneath the desert surface. The wind patterns are complex enough to build a mountain of sand where no sand mountain should logically be. The electromagnetic environment is measurably strange in certain locations. The acoustic properties of the basin can produce effects that the human nervous system is not well equipped to interpret correctly. And all of this is real, documented, and in some cases still actively studied by geophysicists and atmospheric scientists. None of it requires any additional explanation beyond the physics of the Earth itself. But here is what makes the San Luis Valley interesting rather than just geologically notable. These physical conditions do not explain everything that has been reported in the valley. They provide a framework, a set of mechanisms that can account for certain categories of experience. They are important and they should not be dismissed. At the same time, the valley's documented strangeness extends into areas that the geology alone does not touch, into the biological, the historical, the social, and into cases where the physical details recorded by witnesses and investigators do not map neatly onto any known natural process. The geology is the foundation. It sets the stage. It creates a place where perception is already somewhat unreliable, where the environment itself generates effects that can be mistaken for things they are not. That matters. But the story built on that foundation goes considerably further, and the story is old, far older than any of the scientific investigations, far older than the ranchers and their cattle, far older than the Spanish expeditions that first brought European eyes to the valley in the 16th century. The first people to live in the San Luis Valley arrived when the geology was already doing everything it does now. The rift widening, the aquifer filling, the dunes building, and they lived with it for thousands of years. They developed their own understanding of what the valley was, what it meant, and what it was capable of. That understanding is not a footnote to the valley's story. In many ways, it is the beginning of it. The human presence in the San Luis Valley goes back a very long time. Archaeologists have found Folsom points near the base of the Great Sand Dunes, small, carefully shaped stone projectile tips that date to roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years ago. Folsom points are associated with hunters who pursued now extinct megafauna, including a species of giant bison that was considerably larger than the bison we know today. The people who made those points were moving through a landscape that would have looked somewhat different from the valley we can picture now. Cooler, perhaps wetter in places, with different plant communities across the floor. But the basic geography was already there. The mountains were already where they are. The rift was already pulling the floor downward. The aquifer was already full. Whatever those earliest inhabitants experienced in the valley, they experienced it in a place that was already doing everything the valley does. What we know about those first people is mostly material. Tools, bones, traces of fire. Their names for the valley, their understanding of it, their stories about it, did not survive in any form we can read directly. The record becomes more legible as we move forward in time toward the cultures and nations whose descendants are still present in the region today. The Ute people are among the most important of those. The Southern Ute and the Ute Mountain Ute have deep roots in this landscape, and their relationship with the San Luis Valley and the surrounding mountains stretches back centuries before any European ever saw the place. The Ute called the Sangre de Cristo Range by names that varied across different bands and time periods, but the mountains were understood as a significant boundary and a spiritually charged landscape. The high peaks were not simply terrain obstacles, they were presences. The Ute relationship with the land was not the relationship of people passing through it, but of people embedded in it, people who had learned, over many generations, where the valley's moods were and what they meant. The Tiwa-speaking Pueblo communities also had a long relationship with the valley's edges. Taos Pueblo, one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America, sits just south of the valley proper, and the Tiwa people's connection to the Sangre de Cristo Range is woven into their ceremonial and spiritual life in ways that are still living and active today. The mountains are not historical background for these communities. They are ongoing participants in a relationship that has never ended. What is harder to document precisely, but what comes through in oral traditions and in the accounts of researchers who have spent time listening to indigenous knowledge keepers, is the idea that the San Luis Valley was understood as a place of particular power, not simply beautiful or useful, but charged in a way that demanded respect and caution. Some traditions describe the valley as a place of healing, a location where certain kinds of restoration or ceremony were appropriate. Others carry warnings. The valley's floor, in some accounts, was not somewhere you wandered carelessly after dark. The lights that appeared over the flat ground at night were not simply lights. They were something that required a specific kind of knowledge to understand and a specific kind of conduct to navigate safely. It would be easy to fold these accounts into a tidy narrative about ancient people sensing the valley's electromagnetic strangeness, about oral tradition preserving folk memories of infrasound or plasma phenomena in the language available to them. That kind of interpretation is not entirely wrong. There is probably something to it, but it also flattens what these traditions actually are. They are not primitive science. They are sophisticated frameworks developed over thousands of years of close observation and experience, and they carry information that the people who hold them consider accurate and important, not metaphorical. The valley was strange. The people who lived in it knew it was strange. They built their understanding of that strangeness into their cosmology, their ceremony, their practical knowledge of how to move through the landscape safely. Trinchera Cave, located in the southern part of the valley in what is now Castilla County, offers a more concrete piece of this long human record. Archaeological excavations there have uncovered evidence of use spanning thousands of years. Animal bones, stone tools, ash layers from fires built at different periods. The cave sits in a limestone formation near the valley's edge, and it appears to have served as a shelter, a hunting camp, and possibly something more ceremonial over its long history of use. It is not a dramatic sight by the standards of the American Southwest. It is not Chaco Canyon or Mesa Verde. But it is a physical anchor for the idea that people have been living seriously in this valley for a very long time, and that the valley has been part of their lives in ways that go beyond simple subsistence. The spiritual significance of Blanca Peak to the Navajo adds another layer to this picture, though it requires a moment to sit with. Blanca Peak, at 14,351 feet, is the highest point in the Sangre de Cristo Range and the fourth highest peak in Colorado. The Navajo, whose traditional homeland is centered in what is now the Four Corners region, primarily Arizona and New Mexico, consider Blanca Peak one of their 4 sacred mountains, the Mountain of the East, Cisna Asgini, sometimes translated as Dawn or Whiteshell Mountain. In Navajo cosmology, these 4 mountains define the boundaries of Dineta, the homeland. The fact that one of those mountains is in southern Colorado, well to the north of the main concentration of Navajo territory, tells you something about the geographic scope of Navajo knowledge and relationship with the land. A scope that does not map neatly onto the state boundaries we use today. The Navajo relationship with Blanca Peak is not historical in the sense of being past. It is present. The mountain is still considered sacred. Ceremonies connected to it are still practiced. And the Navajo oral tradition carries accounts of the mountain and the valley around it that describe a place of significant spiritual intensity, a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and other dimensions of experience was considered thin. That language, that framework, is very different from the language of UFO researchers or paranormal investigators, but it is pointing at the same landscape, and it has been pointing at it for far longer. There is also the question of what indigenous accounts actually say about the lights and unusual phenomena in the valley. This is an area where it is important to be careful, because there is a long and unfortunate history of outsiders appropriating or misrepresenting indigenous spiritual knowledge to support their own frameworks, taking a ceremonial account of a spirit being and repackaging it as an alien encounter, for example, which is both intellectually dishonest and disrespectful. What can be said more carefully is this: accounts of unusual lights moving over the valley floor at night, of sounds without visible sources, of animals behaving strangely in certain areas, of a sense of presence in specific locations. These are not modern inventions. They appear in the oral traditions of multiple nations who lived in and around the valley, in forms that clearly predate any contact with European ideas about ghosts or extraterrestrials, or any of the other frameworks that would later be applied to the same phenomena. The experiences being described are old. The valley was producing them, or people were having them, long before anyone had a modern vocabulary to describe them. What those experiences actually are, whether they are perceptual effects produced by the valley's unusual physical environment, whether they reflect genuine encounters with something that does not fit neatly into any current scientific category, or whether they are something else entirely, is a question that the indigenous traditions do not answer in the terms that modern investigators tend to prefer. They answer it in their own terms, which are coherent and internally consistent, and which have the advantage of being developed by people with far more direct and long-term experience of the valley than any outside researcher. That is worth something. It does not settle the question, but it is worth something. The valley's human history before European contact is not a backdrop to the strange things that happened later. It is the first chapter of a very long story about a place that consistently produces experiences that people feel compelled to explain, to interpret, to incorporate into whatever framework they are working with. The Ute and the Tiwa and the Navajo and the many other peoples who moved through or lived in the valley over thousands of years were doing exactly what every subsequent group of people in the valley has done. They were trying to make sense of a place that does not fully cooperate with any single explanation. There is something quietly significant about that continuity. The valley has been generating questions for at least 11,000 years. Every generation that has lived with it has developed its own answer, its own way of holding the strangeness. And none of those answers has been complete enough to make the question stop. The lights keep appearing. The animals keep behaving in ways that do not fit the pattern. The sense of the place being charged with something, whether you call it power or energy or electromagnetic anomaly or spirit, persists across every cultural framework that has been brought to bear on it. The Folsom hunters left their stone points near the dunes and moved on, or stayed and became something else, and we do not know what they made of the valley's strangeness. The Ute and the Tiwa built their understanding into living traditions that are still held by living people. The Spanish, when they arrived in the 16th century, would bring their own framework, Catholic, colonial, shaped by a European tradition of interpreting the unfamiliar through the lens of miracle and threat. They would name the mountains with the blood of Christ. They would build towns and plant crops and establish land grants and try, in the way that colonial powers do, to make the valley legible and manageable on their own terms. They would also, quietly and without much fanfare in the historical record, begin reporting lights over the valley floor at night that they could not explain. Travellers along the Camino Real who passed through the region came back with stories. Early settlers in the Spanish land grant communities described things they had seen that did not fit into their experience of other places. The valley was already doing what it does. The Spanish simply added another layer of witnesses, another set of accounts, another cultural framework stretched over a landscape that was already old and already strange by the time the first European boots touched its floor. That moment of contact, Spanish colonizers arriving in a valley that indigenous peoples had been living with and interpreting for thousands of years, is where the documentary record begins to thicken. Where names get written down and expeditions get logged, and the valley starts to accumulate a paper trail alongside its older oral one. And the paper trail, from its very beginning, contains things that are difficult to explain. The first Spanish expedition to pass through the region in any documented way was led by Juan de Oñate in 1598. Oñate was a wealthy colonial governor, ambitious and brutal by most historical accounts, and his primary mission was not to explore the San Luis Valley specifically, but to establish Spanish authority over the northern territories of New Spain, what would eventually become New Mexico and southern Colorado. His route took his party through the corridor that would later be formalized as the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, the royal road of the interior, which connected Mexico City to the northern frontier settlements. The valley was not the destination, it was the passage. But passages leave records, and the records from the early colonial period in this region carry a particular quality, a sense of the landscape pressing in on the people moving through it, demanding to be noticed. The naming of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains is one of those details that lodges in the mind and stays there. The name translates directly as the blood of Christ, and there are a few versions of the story about how it came to be attached to this particular range. The most commonly repeated version involves a dying Spanish priest, somewhere in the early colonial period, who looked up at the mountains at sunset and saw them glowing red. That deep crimson that the Sangre de Cristo range does, in fact, produce in certain evening light conditions, when the snow on the upper peaks catches the last angle of the sun and turns a colour that is genuinely startling if you have never seen it before. The priest, the story goes, looked at those red mountains as he was dying and said those two words, Sangre de Cristo. It is a good story, the kind that probably contains some truth and some embellishment in equal measure, and the name itself is accurate in a literal sense. On the right evening, the mountains really do look like that, and it is not a subtle effect. It is striking enough that you understand why someone would reach for religious language to describe it. Whether the story of the priest is true or not, the name stuck, and it has been attached to those mountains ever since, which means that for over 400 years, The eastern wall of the San Luis Valley has been called the Blood of Christ. That is not a neutral name for a place. It carries weight. The valley became part of the broader Camino Real corridor, which meant that over the 17th and 18th centuries, it was traversed by a steady, if not heavy, flow of Spanish colonial traffic. Missionaries, soldiers, traders, settlers moving between the established communities of New Mexico and the uncertain northern territories. These were people accustomed to hard travel and unfamiliar landscapes, not easily rattled, and yet the accounts that filter through the colonial record from this region have an unusual quality. References to lights seen moving over the valley floor at night, sounds that travellers could not account for, a general sense recorded with the kind of careful understatement that suggests the writer is trying not to sound credulous, that this particular stretch of territory was not entirely ordinary. The lights were explained as will-o'-the-wisps, the old European folk term for the flickering lights sometimes seen over marshy ground, thought to be produced by gases from decaying organic matter, or in some traditions believed to be spirits of the dead leading travellers astray. The valley did have marshy areas, particularly around the seasonal lakes and the edges of the aquifer, where water came close to the surface, so the explanation was available and it was applied. But the will-o'-the-wisp explanation works best for lights that flicker and drift close to the ground, and some of the accounts from this period describe lights that moved in ways that did not quite match that template. They were filed away regardless, because the colonial project did not have much patience for phenomena that did not fit into available categories. The Spanish land grants came later, mostly in the early 19th century, as the Spanish colonial administration and then the newly independent Mexican government tried to encourage settlement in the northern territories. These grants were enormous by any reasonable measure, vast tracts of land assigned to individual families or groups, intended to anchor a Spanish-speaking Catholic presence in territory that was still contested and still largely unfamiliar to European settlers. The most significant of these grants in the San Luis Valley was the Baca Grande Grant, sometimes called the Luis Maria Baca Grant, which covered approximately 100,000 acres of valley floor and mountain terrain. 100,000 acres. To put that in some kind of scale, that is roughly the size of a mid-sized American city's entire metropolitan area assigned to a single land grant. The history of the Baca Grant is complicated in the way that all large colonial land grants in the American Southwest are complicated. Disputed ownership, competing claims, legal battles that stretched across generations, and a gradual fragmentation and consolidation of the land over the 19th and 20th centuries. The grant would eventually become significant again in the late 20th century for reasons that had nothing to do with agriculture, but that part of the story comes later. The town of San Luis, Colorado was established in 1851, which makes it the oldest continuously inhabited town in the entire state of Colorado. That is a specific and somewhat remarkable distinction. Colorado is not a young state by American standards, but San Luis predates its statehood by 25 years, and it predates many of the more famous Colorado settlements. The mining towns, the railroad towns, the resort towns, by decades. It was founded by Hispanic settlers, descendants of the Spanish colonial families who had been in the region for generations, and it sits in the southern end of the valley near the New Mexico border. The town today has a population of around 600 people. It has a Catholic church, a community centre, the stations of the cross shrine on a hill above the town, a series of bronze sculptures by the artist Huberto Maestas that wind up the hillside in the traditional Catholic devotional pattern. It is a quiet place, deeply rooted, with the particular quality of a community that has been in the same location for a very long time and has developed its own internal coherence that does not depend on outside attention. The people of San Luis are not, for the most part, interested in the valley's reputation for strangeness. They have been living here since before that reputation existed in its modern form, and their relationship with the land is more practical and more personal than the frameworks that outside investigators tend to bring. But even in the early records from San Luis and the surrounding Hispanic communities, There are accounts of things seen in the valley that the settlers did not have easy explanations for. Lights over the dunes at night, reported by people who were not prone to exaggeration and who were familiar enough with the landscape to know what was normal and what was not. Strange sounds heard in certain areas, particularly near the mountains. Animals behaving in ways that did not fit ordinary predator-prey patterns. These accounts were generally not written down in formal documents. They circulated in the oral tradition of the community, passed down through families, treated as local knowledge rather than sensational news. They were not framed as supernatural events necessarily, but as things that happened in this particular place, things you should be aware of if you were going to spend time in certain parts of the valley. Practical information about a place that had its own rules. The Baca Grande land grant, that enormous 100,000-acre tract, had a complicated ownership history through the 19th and 20th centuries. It passed through various hands, was subdivided and consolidated, was the subject of legal disputes that wound through the courts for years. In the mid-20th century, a significant portion of it was owned by various corporate and private interests who attempted at different points to develop it, as a cattle operation, as a potential resort community, as a speculative real estate venture. None of these efforts fully took hold, which is itself somewhat interesting given the scale of the land and the investment it represented. The valley has a way of resisting certain kinds of development, not through any dramatic opposition, but simply by being what it is: remote, extreme in its weather, demanding of the people who try to work it. The Baca Grant land sat, largely undeveloped, through most of the 20th century, waiting for whatever came next. What came next, in the 1970s, would be one of the stranger chapters in the valley's already strange history, but that belongs to the section on Crestone. What the Spanish colonial period added to the valley's accumulated strangeness was, above all, a paper trail. For the first time, accounts of the valley's unusual qualities were being written down in a language and a format that could be preserved and eventually studied. The indigenous oral traditions had been carrying this information for thousands of years, but they were not accessible to the colonial record keepers, and they have only been partially accessible to later researchers. The Spanish accounts, the expedition logs, the land grant documents, the church records, the letters between administrators, began to create a documentary layer over the valley's older oral history. And that documentary layer from its very beginning contains anomalies. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that would have stopped anyone in their tracks or caused a formal investigation, but persistent ones. The lights, the sounds, the animals, the sense, expressed with varying degrees of directness by various writers over the colonial period, that this particular valley was not quite like other valleys. There is something worth pausing on in that persistence. The Spanish colonizers were not a credulous people in the way that term is sometimes used dismissively. They were operating within a Catholic framework that had very specific categories for the supernatural: miracles, demonic activity, divine signs, and those categories were taken seriously and investigated formally when they appeared to apply. The Inquisition was still operating during the early colonial period. Reports of unusual phenomena were not simply accepted and passed along without scrutiny, and yet the lights over the San Luis Valley floor kept appearing in the accounts, kept being noted, kept being explained away with the available vocabulary. Will-o'-the-wisps, marsh gas, the effects of altitude on tired eyes, and then appearing again in the next account, and the next. The explanation was applied and the phenomenon continued. That pattern, explanation applied, phenomenon continues, is one that will repeat itself throughout the valley's history, across every cultural framework that has been brought to bear on it, right up to the present. By the time the United States acquired the territory through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 and the Gadsden Purchase in 1853, the San Luis Valley had already accumulated several centuries of European documentation to go alongside its thousands of years of indigenous oral tradition. The valley was, on paper, a known place, surveyed, named, granted, settled, travelled through, and yet the accounts that came out of it, from the earlier Spanish expeditions through the established Hispanic communities of the mid-19th century, carried this persistent undertone of something that did not fit. Something that the available frameworks could account for, sort of, if you were willing to accept the explanation without looking too closely at it. Something that kept coming back. The American period would bring new settlers, new frameworks, new investigators, and eventually a level of outside attention that the valley had never experienced before. The ranching families who moved into the valley in the late 19th century were practical people, shaped by a frontier culture that was deeply skeptical of anything that could not be explained in material terms. They were not, as a rule, interested in mysteries. They were interested in water rights and grazing land and the price of cattle, and many of them, over the following decades, would have experiences in the valley that they could not explain, and would talk about those experiences quietly, among themselves, in the way that people do when they have seen something they cannot account for and are not sure they want to advertise it. The valley had been doing this to people for a very long time. It was about to start doing it in ways that would attract national and eventually international attention. The 20th century was coming, and with it, a particular kind of strangeness that the Spanish colonial administrators and the Ute elders and the Folsom hunters had not encountered. The strangeness of finding dead animals in the field with wounds that no one could explain and no tracks around the body and no blood on the ground. It started with a horse, or rather, it started with what was left of a horse. On the morning of September 9th, 1967, a woman named Nellie Lewis drove out across her family's ranch near Alamosa, Colorado, to check on a 3-year-old Appaloosa named Lady. Lady had not come in the previous evening, which was unusual. When Nellie found her, the horse was dead in a field about a quarter-mile from the ranch buildings. And what Nellie Lewis saw when she got close to the body was something she would spend the rest of her life trying to find a reasonable explanation for and never quite managing it. The flesh had been removed from Lady's neck and skull with a precision that, by every account from people who examined the carcass in the following days, did not resemble the work of any predator anyone had seen before. The cuts were clean, not torn, not gnawed. Clean, as if made with a very sharp instrument along deliberate lines. The brain and spinal fluid were gone. The organs in the chest cavity had been removed. And on the ground around the body there was no blood. Not a small amount of blood. Not blood that had soaked into the earth. No blood. The ground was dry. There were no tracks around the carcass. Not coyote tracks. Not mountain lion tracks. Not the marks of any scavenger that would ordinarily be drawn to a large dead animal within hours. Nothing had approached the body from any direction that left any trace on the ground. Nellie Lewis's mother, Agnes King, initially reported the horse under the name Snippy, which was actually the name of another horse on the property. The error stuck in the press, and for decades the case was reported as the Snippy mutilation. The actual horse's name was Lady. It is a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that gets lost when a story moves fast and no one is slowing down to check. The case was reported to local authorities, then picked up by local newspapers, then by the National Wire Services. By October 1967, the story had appeared in papers across the country. People drove out to the Lewis Ranch to see the carcass. Investigators arrived. A pathologist from the University of Colorado examined the remains. His findings were not definitive, but he noted that the cuts showed characteristics inconsistent with predator activity. The United States Forest Service got involved. At some point, so did representatives from Lowry Air Force Base. The FBI eventually reviewed the files, though they concluded they had no jurisdiction over the death of a horse. What made the Snippy case significant was not just the strangeness of what had happened to Lady. It was the timing and the location, and the fact that it was the first case of its kind to receive sustained national media attention. Because ranchers in the San Luis Valley and in the surrounding counties of southern Colorado and northern New Mexico had been finding dead animals with similar characteristics for years, They just had not been calling anyone about it. You do not call the newspaper when you find a dead cow. You document it for insurance purposes, if you document it at all, and you move on because you have other animals to feed and other problems to solve. This snippy case broke that silence, and once it broke, reports started coming in from ranchers across the region who had been holding similar stories quietly. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the San Luis Valley and the counties surrounding it became the centre of what investigators began calling the cattle mutilation phenomenon. The reports followed a consistent pattern across hundreds of cases. A rancher would find a cow or a horse or occasionally another animal dead in a field. The blood would be absent from the scene. Specific organs, the tongue, the eyes, the ears, the genitals, the rectum, the udder, would be removed with cuts that appeared surgical in their precision. The edges of the cuts, in many cases, showed what witnesses and some investigators described as cauterization, as if the tissue had been sealed at the cut line rather than simply sliced. There would be no tracks. There would be no signs of struggle. The surrounding grass would sometimes be flattened in a circular pattern, or occasionally the soil would show unusual compaction, but nothing that clearly indicated how the animal had died or how anyone had reached it. In Costilla County, a rancher named Hector Real lost several head of cattle to what he described as these kinds of wounds over a period of a few years in the 1970s. His accounts were investigated by local law enforcement and by private researchers. The pattern in his cases matched the pattern documented elsewhere. The missing organs, the clean cuts, the absence of blood, the absence of tracks. Real was a practical man, a working rancher, not someone inclined toward elaborate theories. He wanted to know what was killing his animals and how to stop it. He never got a satisfactory answer. By 1979, the situation had attracted enough attention that the Department of Justice contracted a former FBI agent named Kenneth Rommel to conduct a formal investigation. Rommel spent about a year reviewing cases across Colorado and New Mexico, interviewing ranchers, examining carcasses, and consulting with veterinarians and forensic pathologists. His report, submitted in 1980, ran to nearly 300 pages. His conclusion was that the mutilations were the result of natural predation followed by scavenger activity, combined with the normal decomposition processes that occur in the hours and days after death. The explanation Rommel offered was this: small predators and insects begin feeding on a carcass very quickly after death, and they tend to focus on the softest tissues first: the eyes, the lips, the tongue, the genitals, the anus. As the body bloats with decomposition gases, blood is forced away from the surface and into the body cavity, which accounts for the apparent absence of blood at the scene. The cuts that appeared surgical were, in Rommel's assessment, the result of hide shrinking and splitting as the body dried, which can create surprisingly clean-looking edges. The absence of tracks around the body could be explained by wind, by the passage of time between death and discovery, or by the fact that small scavengers do not leave obvious tracks in hard or dry ground. It was a thorough report. It was written by someone with genuine investigative experience and no obvious personal stake in a particular outcome. And many ranchers and independent investigators rejected it almost immediately. The reasons they rejected it were not simply emotional or conspiratorial. There were specific physical details in specific cases that the natural predation explanation struggled to account for. In several well-documented cases, veterinarians who examined the carcasses noted that the cuts showed characteristics that were difficult to attribute to animal activity or hide shrinkage. The angles were consistent, the depth was controlled, and in some cases there was evidence of what appeared to be a cutting implement rather than teeth or claws. The cauterized edges that multiple witnesses described are not something that occurs naturally in decomposition or scavenging. Cauterization requires heat. Normal predators do not apply heat to the edges of wounds. The organ removal also presented a problem. Scavengers and small predators do remove soft tissues, but they do not typically remove organs from within the body cavity without disturbing the surrounding tissue, and without leaving evidence of how they entered. In some of the documented mutilation cases, the organs were absent, but the body cavity showed no obvious entry point. No torn hide, no chewed-through rib, no obvious access route. This was not true in every case, and some of the cases that were initially reported as mutilations were almost certainly the result of ordinary scavenging, but some of them were not so easy to dismiss. There is also the matter of blood. Rommel's explanation for the absence of blood, that decomposition forces it away from the surface, is accurate as far as it goes. But it does not fully account for cases where animals were found dead within hours of last being seen alive, before significant decomposition would have occurred and still showed no blood at the scene. In those cases, the timeline makes the natural explanation harder to apply cleanly. What made the mutilation phenomenon genuinely difficult to investigate was the combination of factors. Each individual element of the clean cuts, the missing organs, the absence of blood, the absence of tracks, had a potential natural explanation when considered in isolation. But when all of those elements appeared together in the same case, consistently, across hundreds of reports spanning a decade and a half, the natural explanation started to require a particular arrangement of coincidences that some investigators found increasingly implausible. The theories that filled the explanatory gap were various and not always compatible with each other. Some investigators believed the mutilations were the work of a human group, a cult, a government program conducting covert biological sampling, or some other organised human activity operating at night with equipment that left no trace. This theory accounted for the precision of the cuts and the absence of blood, but required a level of sustained covert organisation across multiple counties and multiple years that seemed logistically improbable without anyone ever being caught or identified. Others connected the mutilations directly to the UFO sightings that were occurring in the same region during the same period, suggesting that whatever was responsible for the lights in the sky was also responsible for what was happening to the animals on the ground. This theory was widely reported and widely dismissed by mainstream investigators, though it persisted in the accounts of ranchers who had seen unusual lights on the nights when they subsequently found mutilated animals. The mutilation reports did not stop after Rommel's report was published. They continued through the 1980s and into the 1990s, and they have continued at a lower frequency into the present. The San Luis Valley and the surrounding region remains one of the most consistently reported areas for this kind of case in the United States. The National Institute for Discovery Science, a private research organisation founded in the 1990s, documented additional cases in the region and found the same patterns that earlier investigators had found. Patterns that were consistent enough across cases to suggest something systematic, but not clear enough to point definitively toward any single explanation. What the mutilation phenomenon did, whatever its ultimate cause, was establish the San Luis Valley in the public imagination as a place where something was happening that the standard explanatory frameworks were not quite capturing. It brought journalists, investigators, scientists, and eventually a much larger wave of outside attention to a valley that had been accumulating strange accounts for centuries, but had mostly been left to process them quietly. The Snippy case in 1967 was, in a sense, the valley's first major introduction to the wider world, not as a beautiful landscape or an agricultural region, or a place of cultural significance, but as a location where something inexplicable had happened, and where the inexplicable seemed to have a habit of recurring. The ranching families who lived through that period of intense outside attention had complicated feelings about it. Some were grateful for the investigation. They wanted answers, they were losing animals, and the economic impact of repeated unexplained losses was real and significant. Others were exhausted by the parade of investigators and journalists who arrived with their theories already formed, who wanted the ranchers to confirm a particular narrative rather than simply report what they had observed. The valley had its own relationship with its own strangeness, a relationship built over generations, and it did not always translate well into the formats that outside attention required. The mutilations also had the effect of drawing a different kind of investigator to the valley. People who were interested not just in the animal deaths, but in the broader pattern of anomalous events that the valley seemed to generate. Because the cattle mutilation reports were not occurring in isolation. They were occurring in the same valley during the same years as an extraordinary density of other unexplained reports. Lights in the sky, objects that moved in ways that aircraft do not move, things seen over the dunes and over the mountains and descending toward the valley floor at night. The mutilations and the sightings were being reported by the same communities, sometimes by the same families, sometimes on the same nights. Whether they were connected was a question that no one could answer with confidence. But the concentration of both in the same place at the same time was something that investigators found very difficult to ignore. The valley had opened a door, or perhaps more accurately, the valley had been standing with its door open for a very long time, and the snippy case had simply made it impossible for the outside world to pretend the door was closed. What came through that door next? The investigators, the researchers, the documentarians, the curious, found a place that was stranger and more layered than the mutilation reports alone had suggested. Because the animal deaths, disturbing as they were only one thread in a much larger pattern. And the lights in the sky above the San Luis Valley had their own long history, their own documented witnesses, and their own set of questions that nobody had managed to answer in any way that stayed answered for very long. So let us talk about the lights, because if the cattle mutilations were the event that first brought the San Luis Valley to national attention, the UFO sightings were the thing that kept it there, and kept it there, and kept it there, in a way that resisted the usual pattern of these stories. The initial burst of coverage, the skeptical debunking, the slow fade into footnote. The valley's aerial phenomena have been reported continuously, across generations of witnesses, in a way that makes them genuinely difficult to dismiss as a collection of misidentified aircraft or overexcited imaginations. Not impossible to dismiss, but difficult. The sheer volume of reports is part of it. The consistency of certain details across reports from people who did not know each other and had no obvious reason to coordinate their accounts is another part. And then there is the geography, which turns out to matter more than you might expect. The San Luis Valley sits at roughly 7,500 feet above sea level. The air is thin and clear. Light pollution is minimal across most of the valley floor. The towns are small, spread far apart, and the agricultural land between them is dark enough at night that the Milky Way is visible as a physical presence overhead, not just a faint smear, but an actual structure you can see the shape of. For anyone who has only ever looked at the sky from a city, the San Luis Valley at night is a different experience entirely. The sky feels closer. Objects in it feel more visible, more detailed, more present. This is worth keeping in mind because it means that things which might go unnoticed in a brighter, lower altitude environment become much more apparent here. Some portion of the valley's high reporting rate is almost certainly explained by the simple fact that people can see the sky properly. That is a real factor, and it would be dishonest to ignore it, but it does not explain everything. It does not explain the consistency of certain specific descriptions across decades of reports. It does not explain the clustering of sightings around particular geographic features, and it does not explain the work of Christopher O'Brien. O'Brien is a researcher who moved to the San Luis Valley in 1989 and spent the next decade and a half methodically documenting anomalous events in the region. His approach was more disciplined than a lot of what passes for UFO investigation. He kept detailed logs, he interviewed witnesses carefully, he tried to establish timelines and corroborate accounts where possible, and he was willing to acknowledge when an event had a conventional explanation. His 1996 book, The Mysterious Valley, compiled over 1,000 separate anomalous events that he documented between 1989 and the mid-1990s alone. Not all of those events were aerial sightings, but a significant number were, and the picture they assembled was striking. The sightings O'Brien documented were not random in their character. Certain types of reports came up again and again. Silent triangular craft, dark against the sky, moving slowly or hovering before accelerating away. Orbs of light, white, orange, occasionally red, moving in formation or in sequences, sometimes blinking out one by one, sometimes splitting apart and rejoining. Objects observed hovering over the great sand dunes, which sit at the southern end of the valley near Alamosa. And perhaps most unusually, objects that appeared to descend into the ground or to emerge from the ground in the open valley floor and along the base of the mountain ranges. That last category is the one that tends to give people pause because it does not fit the usual mental model of aerial phenomena. Things that come from the sky and return to the sky are at least conceptually manageable. Things that appear to go into the earth are a different matter. The Blanca Peak area, which we will spend more time with later, came up repeatedly as a focal point. Reports of lights associated with the mountain itself, not above it, but near it, around it, seemingly from it, appeared in O'Brien's logs with enough regularity to form a pattern. Blanca Peak is the dominant geographic feature of the valley's eastern wall, and it has a particular presence in the landscape that is hard to describe but easy to feel if you have stood in the valley and looked at it. It is simply a very large mountain, and it sits at the edge of a very flat plain, and the combination creates a visual relationship that draws the eye in a way that makes it easy to understand why so many reported events seem to cluster there. The area around Cristone, a small town at the base of the Sangre de Cristo range in the northern part of the valley, was another repeated location in the reports. In 1995, there were multiple sightings near Crestone reported by different witnesses over a period of several months. Lights moving along the ridgeline, objects observed descending toward the valley floor, and at least one account of a large silent craft moving slowly over the town itself at low altitude. Crestone is an unusual place for reasons that go beyond its sighting history, and we will come back to it in detail. But its position in the valley's anomalous geography is worth noting here, because it appears in the records with a frequency that suggests something about that particular location, rather than the valley as a whole. Now, it would be easy at this point to present all of this as straightforward evidence of something extraordinary, and that would be the wrong approach. Because there are serious scientifically grounded questions about what the valley's unusual geology might be producing, and those questions deserve to be taken seriously rather than set aside in favour of a more dramatic narrative. The Rio Grande Rift, which we talked about earlier, is an active continental rift zone. The valley floor is geologically dynamic in ways that are not immediately visible but are measurable. The USGS has documented magnetic anomalies across the valley floor, areas where the local magnetic field deviates from what you would expect based on the surrounding geology. The aquifer system beneath the valley, holding billions of acre-feet of water under pressure in confined layers, creates unusual subsurface acoustic and electromagnetic conditions. And rift zones are associated with piezoelectric effects. When certain kinds of rock are put under tectonic stress, they can generate electrical fields. Those electrical fields, under the right atmospheric conditions, can produce luminous plasma phenomena. Ball lightning is the most commonly cited example of this kind of effect, though ball lightning itself is still not fully understood. Earthquake lights, glowing phenomena observed before and during seismic events, have been documented in rift zones around the world and are now taken seriously enough to be the subject of peer-reviewed research. The San Luis Valley sits directly on one of the most active rift systems in North America. The geological conditions for producing natural luminous phenomena are objectively present. This does not mean that every light seen over the valley is a plasma discharge from tectonic stress, but it means that the valley has a plausible natural mechanism for producing unusual aerial phenomena that most locations simply do not have. Some of what has been reported over the decades may be exactly this: natural geologically produced light phenomena that are genuinely unusual, genuinely difficult to explain without knowing what you're looking for, and genuinely capable of producing reports that sound, on the surface, like something else entirely. There is also the valley's atmospheric behaviour to consider. the extreme temperature swings. The valley can shift 60 degrees Fahrenheit in a single day, which is not a typo. That is a real and documented characteristic of the region. Create powerful atmospheric inversion layers. An inversion layer is a condition where warmer air sits above cooler air near the ground, which is the reverse of the normal atmospheric arrangement. Inversion layers bend light. They can take a distant light source and make it appear to be somewhere it is not, at an altitude it is not at, moving in a direction it is not moving. The San Luis Valley, with its flat floor and its dramatic temperature gradients, produces inversion layers with enough regularity that they have been studied by atmospheric researchers as a distinct regional phenomenon. Some percentage of the valley's aerial sightings are almost certainly inversion layer mirages of perfectly ordinary things: distant car headlights, stars near the horizon, aircraft at high altitude, transformed by atmospheric optics into something that looks genuinely strange. So the picture is complicated. The valley has natural explanations for some of what gets reported. It has geological conditions that could produce genuinely unusual phenomena that are still natural. And it has a substantial residue of reports that do not fit comfortably into either of those categories, even after you account for both. The triangular craft reported by multiple independent witnesses, silent, moving slowly, then accelerating without sound. That does not map neatly onto plasma discharge or atmospheric mirage. The objects reported entering and exiting the ground do not map onto inversion layers. The formations of orbs moving in coordinated patterns, observed by people who had no prior interest in unusual phenomena, and who were simply out at night for ordinary reasons, do not fit the profile of wishful misidentification. What O'Brien's work did, whatever one makes of his conclusions, was established that the San Luis Valley's aerial phenomena were not a handful of isolated reports from excitable individuals. They were a sustained, geographically concentrated pattern of accounts from a wide range of witnesses, including ranchers, law enforcement officers, highway workers, teachers, and people with no particular investment in the subject. The density of reports per square mile, when mapped against the valley's actual population, is striking. These are not a large number of people. The valley has roughly 46,000 residents spread across an enormous area. The number of anomalous reports relative to the population is difficult to explain purely by the enthusiasm of the observers. One thing that does not get discussed enough in the context of the valley's sighting history is what the experience of being in the valley at night is actually like. The darkness is real darkness, not the residual glow of distant cities that most people are accustomed to, but genuine, full, unfiltered darkness. The silence is equally real. The valley floor at night is very quiet, in a way that makes sounds carry and makes the absence of sound feel almost physical. Under those conditions, the human visual system, which is already quite good at detecting motion and light, is operating at its full sensitivity. Things that would be invisible in a noisier, brighter environment become perceptible. This cuts both ways. It means genuine phenomena are more likely to be noticed, and it also means that the threshold for misidentification is lower, because the visual system is working hard in conditions where there is very little competing input. The valley at night is an environment that amplifies perception, for better and for worse. What the valley's sighting record ultimately represents is an accumulation that is difficult to explain away completely, and equally difficult to explain in any single satisfying way. The geology offers partial explanations, the atmosphere offers partial explanations, the darkness and the altitude offer partial explanations for the reporting rate. And after all of those partial explanations are applied, there is still a residue, a set of accounts that do not resolve into anything familiar, reported by people who are not looking for anything unusual, and who often seemed more confused and unsettled than excited by what they had seen. The valley has been generating these accounts for a long time, long before Christopher O'Brien arrived with his notebooks, long before the cattle mutilation reports brought journalists with cameras, long before the 20th century gave people a vocabulary of flying saucers and extraterrestrials to attach to what they were seeing. The indigenous inhabitants of the valley described unusual lights and strange phenomena in the sky and on the ground for centuries before European contact. The Spanish settlers who arrived in the 1600s and 1700s recorded their own accounts, framed in the language of a religious experience or supernatural encounter, rather than the language of aerial craft. The lights were there before anyone had a name for what they might be, and they continued to be reported regardless of what framework the people watching them brought to the experience. That continuity across centuries and across radically different cultural contexts is, in some ways, the most interesting thing about the Valley's sighting history. It suggests that whatever is producing these accounts, whether natural, artificial, or something that does not fit either category cleanly, it is not a product of any particular cultural moment. It predates the UFO era, predates European settlement, predates the cattle mutilation reports that drew modern attention to the region. The valley was strange before anyone decided to call it strange, and it has remained strange across every period of human habitation. Some of the strangest accounts in O'Brien's records came not from long-time residents, but from people who had moved to the valley specifically because of its reputation. People who arrived expecting unusual experiences and, in many cases, found them. Whether that says something about the valley or something about human expectation and perception is a question worth sitting with. The answer is probably not simple. But what those newcomers found when they arrived was a community of long-term residents who had their own quiet, matter-of-fact relationship with the valley's strangeness. People who had grown up with the lights and the stories and the occasional inexplicable event, who did not necessarily find it dramatic, who simply lived with it as one of the valley's characteristics, the way you live with the wind or the altitude or the cold. That ordinariness, that background hum of the unexplained treated as simply part of the place, is perhaps the most telling thing of all. And a significant number of those people who came to the valley following its reputation ended up settling in one particular location, a small town at the base of the mountains, at the edge of a vast former ranch property, in a place that had drawn spiritual communities from around the world to a valley that most of the country had never heard of. A place that had become, by the 1990s, one of the stranger concentrations of human intention and unexplained experience in the American West, a place called Crestone. Crestone sits at an elevation of about 8,000 feet, at the point where the valley floor meets the lower slopes of the Sangre de Cristo Range. It is a very small town. The population hovers around 150 people, depending on the season and who you ask, and the streets are mostly unpaved. There is a small general store, a few cafes that keep irregular hours, and a post office. If you drove through without knowing anything about it, you might register it as a quiet, slightly eccentric mountain town and keep going. But if you stopped and looked around, you would start to notice things. There are prayer flags on a lot of the buildings. There are signs for meditation centres and dharma halls and retreat facilities. There are Tibetan stupas, white dome-shaped shrines, sitting in the scrubland at the edge of town, looking entirely at home against the backdrop of the mountains. And if you talk to people long enough, you would start to hear a particular kind of story, told quietly and without drama, about things they had seen or felt in the valley and in the mountains above. Crestone is home to more than 24 spiritual centres and retreat communities, which is an extraordinary concentration for a town of 150 people in rural southern Colorado. There are Tibetan Buddhist centres, including the Pundarika Foundation and the Shumei International Institute. There is a Carmelite Catholic hermitage. There are Zen centres, Hindu ashrams, Sufi communities, and various other organisations that do not fit neatly into any single tradition. Some of these facilities are quite small, a handful of buildings, a handful of residents. Others are substantial, with multiple structures, libraries and accommodations for visiting practitioners. All of them are here, in the same remote valley, within a few miles of each other, which raises an obvious question. How did this happen? The answer traces back to a man named Maurice Strong and to a piece of land called the Baca Grande. Maurice Strong was a Canadian businessman and diplomat who served as the first executive director of the United Nations Environment Programme and was a key figure in several major international environmental conferences, including the 1972 Stockholm Conference and the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. He was, in other words, not a fringe figure, He was someone with significant influence in international policy circles. In the 1970s, Strong and his wife Hannah purchased a large portion of the Baca Grande property, the same massive land grant that had passed through numerous hands since the Spanish colonial period, with an initial plan to develop it as a resort community. That plan did not materialise. What happened instead was that the Strongs, and particularly Hannah Strong, became convinced that the Crestone area held a particular spiritual significance. Hannah Strong has described receiving guidance, in a form she does not characterise in simple terms, that the land should be used for spiritual purposes rather than commercial development. Beginning in the 1980s, the Strongs, through an organisation called the Manitou Foundation, began donating parcels of the Baca Grande land to spiritual organisations from around the world. The idea, as Hannah Strong articulated it, was that Crestone could become a place where different spiritual traditions could exist in proximity and, ideally, in dialogue with one another. The valley in this framing was understood to be a place of unusual spiritual energy, a convergence point, a place where the boundary between ordinary experience and something else was thinner than usual. Whether or not one accepts that framing, the practical result is visible. Over the following decades, organisations representing traditions from Tibet, Japan, India, Spain and the United States accepted the land donations and built their centres. By the 1990s, Crestone had become one of the most concentrated collections of diverse spiritual communities in North America. Some people who have written about Crestone describe it in terms of ley lines, the idea that certain locations on the Earth's surface sit at intersections of subtle energy channels that have been recognised by various cultures across history. This is a speculative concept, not something that has been measured or verified by any scientific instrument. But it is worth noting that the idea of Crestone as a convergence point did not originate with New Age writers in the 1980s. The area around the Sangre de Cristo range has been considered spiritually significant by indigenous peoples of the region for a very long time, for reasons that predate any ley line theory by centuries. Whether the modern spiritual community in Crestone is responding to something genuinely present in the landscape, or whether they are responding to a story about the landscape, or whether those two things are even fully separable, is a question that the valley does not resolve. What is clear is that the town attracts a particular kind of person. Among Crestone's small permanent population and its larger rotating community of retreat participants and visitors, you find former academics, former government employees, scientists, artists, and a notable number of people who describe having had experiences that changed their understanding of what is possible. Not all of these experiences are spiritual in the traditional sense. Some are perceptual, things seen in the sky or on the ground that they could not account for. Some are more internal, a sense of presence, or of being observed, or of time moving differently than expected. Some people arrived in Crestone with these experiences already in their history and felt drawn to the valley because of them. Others arrived for unrelated reasons and had the experiences afterward. It would be easy, and not entirely wrong, to attribute some of this to the self-selecting nature of the community. People who are open to unusual experience, or who are actively seeking it, may be more likely to report it. That is a reasonable point, but it does not fully account for the accounts that come from people who are not seeking anything in particular. The retreat participants who came for a week of quiet meditation and left with something they did not expect, or the construction workers who spent a season building facilities in the area and returned home with stories they were not sure how to tell. One thing that is genuinely unusual about Crestone, and which is documented and verifiable, is the sky burial site located in the hills above the town. Sky burial, the practice of leaving a human body exposed on an elevated platform or rock face to be consumed by birds and the elements, is a traditional funerary practice in Tibet and several other cultures. It is not commonly practiced in the United States, for obvious legal and practical reasons. But Crestone has one of the very few locations in the country where this practice is legally permitted, established through careful work with local, state and federal authorities. This site is maintained by the Crestone End of Life Project, a community organisation that also facilitates open-air cremations. This is by any measure an unusual thing for a small Colorado town to have arranged. It reflects the degree to which Crestone is genuinely committed to being a different kind of place, not just in the abstract language of spiritual aspiration, but in the concrete practical details of how it handles death. The relationship between Crestone and the broader valley is complicated in ways that are worth understanding. Many long-time residents of the valley, the ranching families, the farmers, the people whose families have been in the area for generations, have a complicated relationship with the Crestone community. Some find it eccentric but harmless. Some are genuinely interested in the spiritual centres and have participated in their programs. Some find it alienating, a community that arrived from outside and overlaid its own frameworks onto a landscape that already had a long history and a set of people living in it. This tension is not unique to Crestone or to the San Luis Valley. It is a version of a dynamic that plays out in many rural areas that attract outsiders drawn by scenery, reputation, or spiritual significance. But in the valley it has a particular texture, because the valley's strangeness is something that everyone who lives there has some relationship with, whether they talk about it or not. The people who have lived in the valley for generations tend to be matter-of-fact about the unexplained in a way that newcomers sometimes find disarming. A rancher in Castilla County who has seen lights over the valley floor on multiple occasions may not have any particular theory about what they are. He may not be interested in developing one. He has seen them, they were strange, and he went back to work the next morning. That pragmatic relationship with the unexplained, treating it as simply one feature of the landscape, like the wind or the altitude, rather than as a mystery demanding resolution, is something that many of the longer-term Crestone residents have also developed over time. The spiritual framework that brought them there gives them a language for unusual experience, but many of them are not particularly evangelical about it. They are not trying to convince anyone. They are simply living in a place that is, in their experience, unusual, and getting on with their lives within that unusualness. What Crestone adds to the valley's overall picture is something specific, a community of people who came to the valley because of a belief in its significance, and who stayed because that belief was, in their experience, confirmed. Not all of them would phrase it that way. But the concentration of people with unusual experiences in a small town at the base of a mountain range that has been considered sacred by multiple cultures across a very long period of time is not something that can be entirely explained by coincidence or by the self-fulfilling nature of expectation, or at least it is not obvious that it can be. The Manitou Foundation continues to operate in Crestone, though Marie Strong died in 2015, and the organisation has evolved since its founding period. The spiritual centres continue to function. New organisations have arrived and some older ones have changed form or closed. The town remains small, the roads remain mostly unpaved, and the prayer flags continue to move in the wind that comes down off the mountains in the afternoon. There is one more thing about Crestone that tends to come up in conversations with people who have spent time there, and it is difficult to categorise. Several people, including researchers and visitors with no particular predisposition toward unusual experience, have described a quality of attention in the landscape around Crestone, a sense, not dramatic or frightening, but persistent, of being in a place that is paying attention back. This is not a scientific observation. It is not something that can be measured, but it comes up often enough from people who are not looking for it and who are sometimes embarrassed to mention it that it feels worth noting. The valley has that quality in several of its locations, but Crestone, at the base of the mountains, at the edge of the former Baca Grande land, seems to concentrate it. Whether that quality is a product of the landscape itself, or of the accumulated intention of the communities that have gathered there, or of the long history of spiritual significance that the area carries from its indigenous past, or simply of the silence and the altitude and the darkness. It is not possible to say with any confidence. The valley does not offer clean answers to questions like that. It offers the question, and then it waits. The mountains above Crestone rise steeply from the valley floor, and at the top of that range, visible from the town on clear days, is the valley's most prominent peak. A mountain that has its own long history of unusual reports, its own sacred significance to peoples who lived hundreds of miles from its base, and its own set of accounts that researchers have spent years trying to make sense of. A mountain that sits at the eastern wall of the valley and seems by many accounts to be more than simply geography. That mountain is Blanca Peak. It rises to 14,351 feet, which makes it the fourth highest summit in Colorado and one of the highest points in the entire Rocky Mountain system. From the valley floor, it is a significant presence. Not the tallest thing visible, but somehow the most prominent, the one the eye returns to. The peak sits at the southern end of the Sangre de Cristo range, near the point where the mountains begin to lower and the valley opens toward New Mexico. On clear mornings, the upper slopes catch the light before anything else does, and the effect is striking in a way that is hard to describe without sounding like you're exaggerating. Most visitors to the region know Blanca Peak, if they know it at all, as a mountaineering destination. The approach is genuinely difficult. The standard route goes up through a four-wheel drive road along Lake Como, a high alpine lake sitting at around 11,750 feet, and then continues on foot through increasingly technical terrain. The road to Lake Como is considered one of the most challenging vehicle approaches to any 14er in the state, with large boulders, steep grades, and sections that have damaged or destroyed vehicles driven by people who underestimated what they were getting into. Climbers who have made the approach describe it as humbling even before the real ascent begins. The lake itself is beautiful in the way that high alpine lakes tend to be, cold, clear, surrounded by rock, and very quiet. But climbers have noted something about the approach that comes up with enough regularity to be worth mentioning. A quality of disorientation that seems out of proportion to the altitude and the physical effort. Not altitude sickness exactly, which has its own recognisable profile. More like a difficulty concentrating, a sense of spatial uncertainty, a feeling that the distances are not quite behaving the way they should. Some have mentioned compasses behaving oddly in the area, though this is difficult to verify, and compasses can be affected by local mineral deposits in mountain terrain generally. Others have reported equipment failures, cameras, GPS units, communication devices, that resolved once they descended. These are the kinds of reports that are easy to dismiss individually and harder to dismiss when they accumulate from people who did not know about previous accounts and were not looking for anything unusual. But the deeper strangeness of Blanca Peak is not about the climb. It is about what the mountain means and where that meaning comes from. The Navajo people, the Diné, consider Blanca Peak one of the four sacred mountains that define the boundaries of Dinéta, their traditional homeland. They call it Cisnasjini, which translates roughly as the Dawn Mountain, or the White Shell Mountain. It marks the eastern boundary of the Navajo world. The other three sacred mountains are Mount Taylor in New Mexico to the south, the San Francisco Peaks in Arizona to the west, and Esperas Peak in the La Plata Mountains of Colorado to the north. Together, these four mountains define a territory of enormous cultural and spiritual significance. Ceremonies, prayers, and cosmological teachings within Navajo tradition reference these mountains continuously. They are not simply landmarks, they are structural features of the Navajo universe. What makes this significant in the context of the San Luis Valley is the geography. The Navajo homeland, as most people understand it, is centered in the Four Corners region: northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, southeastern Utah, and southwestern Colorado. Blanca Peak is in southern Colorado, at the far northeastern edge of that defined territory. For the Diné to have oriented their cosmology around a mountain that sits in what is now the San Luis Valley, a mountain that is genuinely remote from the core of their historical territory, suggests a historical relationship with this landscape that runs very deep. It suggests knowledge of this place, sustained attention to this place, over a very long time. The valley was not peripheral to the Navajo world. It was a boundary marker, and boundary markers in Navajo cosmology are not arbitrary. They are places of power, places where the ordinary world and something else come into contact. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is the documented understanding within Navajo tradition, maintained and transmitted across generations. The sacredness of Blanca Peak to the Diné is not a recent attribution or a spiritual tourism designation. It is an old, specific, and carefully maintained belief about what this mountain is and what it does. Reports of unusual light phenomena around Blanca Peak have come from multiple directions over the years. Some come from valley residents who have watched the mountain from a distance. Some come from climbers. Some come from researchers who are specifically investigating the area. Christopher O'Brien, who spent more than a decade documenting anomalous events in the valley, described Blanca and the surrounding area as one of the most consistently active zones in the entire region. The reports he collected were not all of the same type. Some described lights above the peak, orbs, slow-moving points of illumination that did not behave like aircraft or satellites. But a specific and more unusual category of report described lights that appeared to emerge from the mountain itself, or to descend into it. Not lights in the sky above the peak, but lights that seemed to interact with the rock, appearing at the slopes and then fading, or appearing at the base and rising. This distinction matters because it shifts the phenomenon from something atmospheric, something in the air above the mountain, to something that seems to involve the mountain as a location in a more direct way. In 1994, O'Brien documented an incident involving multiple witnesses near the base of Blanca Peak. The details, as he recorded them, described a light that appeared on the lower slopes of the mountain in the early evening, moved in a way that did not correspond to any vehicle or aircraft, and then appeared to descend below the ridgeline, not to pass over it, but to go into it. The witnesses were not people who had come to the valley looking for unusual phenomena. They were in the area for unrelated reasons and were not aware at the time of the mountain's reputation. O'Brien interviewed them separately. Their accounts were consistent in the basic details, though they differed in minor ways, as witness accounts of unusual events typically do. He was careful to note that he could not determine what the witnesses had actually seen, only that they had seen something they could not explain, and that their descriptions fit a pattern of reports he had been collecting from the same area over several years. The Blanca Peak area also sits in a zone of documented geomagnetic anomaly. The USGS has mapped magnetic field variations across the San Luis Valley, and the southern end of the valley, the area around Blanca and the adjacent terrain, shows measurable deviations from the expected field. This is not unusual in mountain terrain, where iron-bearing rocks can produce local magnetic variations. But the scale and distribution of the anomalies in this area are notable enough that they show up clearly in survey data. Whether these magnetic variations have any relationship to the reported phenomena is genuinely unknown. It is one of those cases where a documented physical property and a set of unexplained reports exist in the same location, and the temptation to connect them is understandable, but the connection itself remains unproven. There is also the matter of the sounds. Several accounts from the Blanca area, from climbers, from valley residents, from people camping in the vicinity, describe unusual auditory experiences. Deep, low-frequency sounds that seem to come from no identifiable direction. A kind of humming or resonance that is felt as much as heard. Infrasound, sound frequencies below the threshold of human hearing, is known to be produced by geological processes, including the movement of fluids through rock, and the settling of large geological structures. The San Luis Valley, sitting on an active rift with a vast aquifer beneath it, is exactly the kind of environment where infrasound production would be expected. An infrasound at certain frequencies has documented effects on human perception, feelings of unease, disorientation, a sense of presence, and in some cases visual disturbances. This is not speculative. It has been studied in laboratory conditions and in field environments. Whether the infrasound produced in the Blanca area is sufficient in intensity and frequency to produce these effects in people spending time near the mountain is something that has not been formally studied. But it is a plausible mechanism for at least some of the reported experiences. None of this explains the lights. Infrasound does not produce visible light phenomena, and the reports of lights near Blanca are too specific and too numerous to be entirely accounted for by perceptual effects. Some of them may be misidentified aircraft. The valley has military flight corridors, and aircraft at certain angles and distances can look very strange, especially in the dark. Some may be atmospheric phenomena. The valley's temperature inversions and unusual atmospheric layering can cause light from distant sources to bend, reflect, and appear in unexpected locations. Ball lightning, while rare, has been documented in the region and could account for some orb-type sightings. These are genuine explanations for genuine subsets of the reports. But the honest position is that they do not account for everything, and the specific category of lights that appear to emerge from or descend into the mountain remains without a satisfying explanation. What is clear is that Blanca Peak functions as a kind of focal point for the valley's strangeness in the same way that certain locations in other landscapes function as concentrators, places where whatever is unusual about a region seems to gather and intensify. The mountain is sacred to the Navajo. It is the site of concentrated anomalous reports. It sits on documented geomagnetic anomalies. It is difficult to approach and produces unexplained experiences in climbers, and it stands at the eastern wall of a valley that has been accumulating unexplained phenomena for as long as anyone has been paying attention. There is something worth pausing on here, which is the relationship between the Navajo designation of Blanca as a sacred boundary marker and the modern pattern of concentrated unusual reports in the same location. These are very different frameworks. One is a cosmological and spiritual tradition maintained across centuries. The other is a collection of contemporary witness accounts gathered by a researcher over a decade. They do not agree on what is happening at the mountain. They do not even share a vocabulary for discussing it, but they agree on the location. They agree that this particular mountain, at this particular point on the eastern wall of this particular valley, is a place where something is different. The convergence of that agreement across such different ways of knowing is at minimum interesting. At maximum, it suggests that whatever quality the mountain has, whatever it is that makes it a place where unusual things are reported, and where multiple cultures have recognized significance, that quality is not a product of any single cultural framework. It is something the place itself seems to carry. That is a careful claim, and it is worth being careful with it. The history of interpreting indigenous sacred sites through the lens of modern anomalous phenomena is complicated and has sometimes been disrespectful, reducing specific and carefully maintained traditions to a kind of general mystical backdrop for outsiders' investigations. The Navajo designation of Blanca Peak as Tisnas Genie is not primarily about UFOs or lights or geomagnetic anomalies. It is about cosmology, identity, and the structure of the Diné world. It deserves to be understood on its own terms first, and the fact that it happens to overlap geographically with a concentration of unexplained modern reports is interesting, but it does not transform the sacred mountain into a prop in someone else's mystery. With that said, the overlap is there, and the valley has a way of producing these overlaps. Places where different kinds of strangeness from different periods and different traditions point at the same location without having coordinated to do so. The eastern wall of the valley from Blanca north through the Sangre de Cristo range continues to generate reports. The area around Cristone, which sits further north along that same wall, has its own concentration of accounts as we have already visited. But the Blanca area has a different character, less populated, more remote, with fewer people living close enough to observe it regularly. What gets reported from there tends to come from people who are passing through, climbing or camping, rather than from residents with years of accumulated observation. That may mean the reports are less reliable in some ways, or it may mean they are more reliable in others. People who have no particular investment in the location and no community framework shaping what they expect to see. The valley does not reveal itself all at once. It accumulates, and the accumulation around Blanca Peak is one of the denser clusters in the entire region. Dense enough that researchers who have spent time in the valley consistently identify it as a priority location, and dense enough that the mountain's reputation has spread well beyond the community of people who follow San Luis Valley phenomena specifically. Below the mountain, the valley floor continues. The aquifer sits beneath it, enormous and largely invisible. The rift continues its slow work of pulling the valley downward. And somewhere under all of that, under the rock and the water and the ancient geology, there are theories, some of them serious and some of them not, about what else might be down there. The valley's strangeness does not only point upward, toward the sky and the mountains. Some of the most persistent and most complicated stories about this place point in the other direction entirely, into the ground itself, into the space beneath the valley floor, where the earth is hollow in ways that are documented and in ways that are very much not. The theories about what lies beneath the San Luis Valley are not all equal. Some of them are grounded in documented geology and federal survey data. Some of them are the product of one man's deteriorating mental state and a deliberate government disinformation campaign. And some of them occupy a strange middle space where real documents, real locations and real institutional behaviour got tangled up with claims that cannot be verified and probably should not be. It is worth being careful here, because the history of how these underground theories developed is itself a genuinely strange story. One that involves the Air Force, a businessman with a radio receiver, and a cascade of consequences that nobody fully intended. The most famous underground claim associated with this region is the Dulce Base legend. Dulce is a small town in northern New Mexico, the seat of the Jicarilla Apache Nation, sitting on the high plateau of the Archuleta Mesa, just south of the Colorado border and just south of the San Luis Valley proper. The legend, which spread through UFO research communities beginning in the 1980s, holds that beneath Archuleta Mesa there exists a large underground facility, jointly operated by the United States government and extraterrestrial beings, where experiments of various kinds are conducted across multiple subterranean levels. The story, in its most elaborated form, describes a 7-level facility with different activities on each floor, conflicts between human and non-human occupants, and a group of human workers who allegedly witnessed things they were not supposed to witness. This is, to be clear, a legend. There is no verified physical evidence of such a facility. No credible whistleblower with verifiable credentials has ever confirmed it. No satellite imaging, no ground-penetrating radar survey, no geological survey has produced anything consistent with a large artificial underground structure beneath Archuleta Mesa. The Jicarilla Apache Nation, whose land this would be, has not reported anything consistent with such a facility operating beneath their territory. The Dulce Base, in the form described by its most enthusiastic proponents, almost certainly does not exist. But the story has an origin, and the origin is real, and the origin is genuinely disturbing in its own right. Paul Benowitz was an Albuquerque businessman and electronics expert, the founder of Thunder Scientific Corporation, which made humidity sensing instruments. He was a serious, technically capable person. Beginning around 1979, Benowitz became convinced that he was intercepting electromagnetic transmissions from extraterrestrial craft near Kirtland Air Force Base on the southern edge of Albuquerque. He built equipment to detect and record these signals. He contacted the Air Force. He wrote reports. He was, by all accounts, genuinely convinced of what he was observing, and he was not obviously a crank. He was a man with technical skills who had found something that seemed real to him. What happened next is documented in declassified records. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations, specifically an agent named Richard Doty, became aware of Benowitz and his activities, and rather than simply telling him he was wrong, or investigating his claims seriously or doing nothing, they made a different choice. They fed him disinformation, deliberately, over a period of years. They provided Benowitz with fabricated documents, fabricated photographs and fabricated stories, including stories about underground bases, about alien-human agreements, about facilities beneath the New Mexico landscape. The intent, as best as can be reconstructed from the available record, was to redirect his attention away from whatever classified conventional activities he might actually be observing near Kirtland, and toward a narrative that was so extreme it would discredit him if he went public. It worked, in the worst possible way. Benowitz's mental health deteriorated significantly under the weight of what he believed he was learning. He became increasingly paranoid, increasingly isolated, and eventually suffered a breakdown serious enough to require hospitalization. The disinformation campaign directed at him is not a conspiracy theory. It has been confirmed in declassified documents, discussed by journalists including investigative reporter Mark Pilkington in his book Mirage Men, and acknowledged by some of the people involved. Richard Doty himself has given interviews over the years that, while not fully consistent, confirm the basic shape of what happened. The Dulspace story that spread through UFO research communities in the 1980s and 1990s was substantially built on the fabricated material fed to Benowitz. Other figures added to it. A woman named Krista Tilton claimed to have been abducted and taken to an underground facility in the Dulce area. A man who called himself Thomas Costello claimed to have worked at the base and described its interior in detail. Neither account has been corroborated. Costello's identity was never verified. No one was able to confirm that a person by that name with the described background existed. These stories circulated through newsletters, early internet forums and UFO conference presentations, growing more detailed and more elaborate with each retelling, as such stories tend to do. The reason any of this matters to the San Luis Valley is partly geographic. Dulce is close enough to the valley that the mythology bled across the border, and researchers who were investigating the valley's own phenomena often found themselves also investigating Dulce-adjacent claims. The valley's own underground strangeness, which is real in geological terms, provided a kind of substrate that made the Dulce story feel plausible to people already primed by the valley's other mysteries. If the valley has a massive hidden aquifer, if it has documented magnetic anomalies, if it has a rift system pulling the floor downward, then the idea of something unusual beneath the surface did not require an enormous imaginative leap for people already paying attention to the region. And here is where it is worth separating things carefully, because the valley's actual subsurface is genuinely interesting, without requiring any extraterrestrial component at all. The aquifer system beneath the San Luis Valley is one of the largest confined aquifers in the western United States. The unconfined aquifer sits in the upper layers of sediment, accessible, relatively well mapped, and the source of much of the valley's agricultural water. Beneath it, separated by a layer of clay and silt that acts as a natural barrier, is the confined aquifer, which holds water under pressure and is much less well understood. The water in the confined aquifer has been there for a very long time. Some of it may have entered the system during the last ice age. It is not being recharged at any meaningful rate by current precipitation. In hydrological terms, the valley is drawing down a resource that took thousands of years to accumulate. The interaction between these aquifer layers and the valley surface creates acoustic and electromagnetic conditions that are not typical of most landscapes. Water moving through confined spaces under pressure generates infrasound. low-frequency sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. The valley's shape, a large flat basin surrounded by mountain walls, functions as a natural resonance chamber for these frequencies. The USGS has documented magnetic anomalies across the valley floor that correspond to variations in the subsurface geology, and some of these anomalies are significant enough to affect compass readings. The valley floor, in other words, is not just flat ground. It is a complex acoustic and electromagnetic environment produced by the geology beneath it, and some of what people experience in the valley, the unease, the disorientation, the sense that something is present, may have a physical basis in these subsurface conditions rather than in anything supernatural. There are also natural cave systems in the region, though not on the scale that underground base mythology would require. The geology of the surrounding mountains includes limestone formations that support cave development, and some of these systems have not been fully mapped. The valley floor itself, being composed largely of sediment deposited over millions of years, does not support the kind of hard rock cave systems you find in limestone country. But the transition zones at the mountain bases are different, and there are documented caves along the Sangre de Cristo range that have not been thoroughly explored. None of this adds up to an underground base, but it does add up to a subsurface environment that is genuinely unusual, that produces measurable physical effects, and that is not fully understood even by the researchers who study it. The valley below ground is as strange as the valley above ground, in ways that are documented and in ways that are still being worked out. The Benowitz story has a quality that keeps surfacing in the history of the San Luis Valley and its surrounding region, the quality of real institutional behaviour that is strange enough to make the stranger claims seem more plausible by proximity. The Air Force did run a disinformation campaign against a private citizen. The Department of Justice did hire a former FBI agent to investigate cattle mutilations. The government did, for years, deny the existence of classified aircraft programs that were later confirmed. Programs that, while they were secret, were producing sightings that looked very much like UFO reports. When institutions behave in ways that are genuinely strange, it becomes harder to calibrate what level of strangeness to accept from other claims about the same region. The documented strangeness raises the baseline. This is part of why the San Luis Valley and its surrounding mythology have proven so durable. It is not simply that people are credulous, or that the landscape is evocative, or that there is a community of researchers reinforcing each other's interpretations. It is that the region has a documented history of unusual events, unusual institutional responses to those events, and unusual physical properties, and that history makes it genuinely difficult to draw a clean line between what is real and what is not. The Dult space is almost certainly not real in the form described, but the disinformation campaign that helped create the Dult space story was very real, and it was directed at a person who was observing something, even if that something was classified conventional technology rather than extraterrestrial craft. The valley absorbs these complications without resolving them. It has been doing so for a long time. The underground mythology sits alongside the geological reality, and the geological reality is strange enough on its own that the mythology does not feel entirely out of place. The aquifer holds billions of acre-feet of water in the dark beneath the valley floor. The rift continues its slow work. The magnetic field above the valley floor varies in ways that instruments can measure, and that the human nervous system may be able to detect, in ways that are not fully understood. What is down there in the documented sense is remarkable. A vast reservoir of ancient water under pressure, a geological fracture that has been widening for tens of millions of years, sediment layers that record the valley's entire history, compressed and preserved in the dark. An acoustic environment that produces frequencies the human ear cannot hear, but the human body may register as unease or wrongness, or the sense of being watched. That is the real subsurface of the San Luis Valley, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on, because it is easy to let the legend of what might be down there crowd out the strangeness of what actually is. The valley floor, from above, looks simple, flat agricultural land, irrigation pivots, the occasional ranch road running straight to the horizon. From below, it is something else entirely, layered, pressurized, acoustically active, magnetically variable, and old in ways that are difficult to fully picture. The water in the confined aquifer may have last seen sunlight during the Pleistocene. The rift beneath it has been opening since before the Rocky Mountains reached their current height. Whatever the valley is doing at the surface, accumulating strange reports, drawing unusual people, generating phenomena that resist easy explanation, it is doing it on top of a subsurface that has its own kind of strangeness, its own kind of depth. The underground theories, the real and the legendary both, point at something the valley seems to insist on, that what is visible is not all there is, that the surface is only part of the story, and that the ground beneath an unusual place may itself be part of what makes it unusual. Whether that ground holds a secret facility, or simply an ancient aquifer and an active rift, the insistence seems appropriate. The valley does not give itself up easily in any direction, not upward into the sky, not outward toward the mountains, and not downward into the earth. The researchers who have taken the valley seriously, the geophysicists, the hydrologists, the atmospheric scientists who have come here to study the rift and the aquifer and the inversion layers, have not found anything that confirms the legend of Dulce, but they have found a great deal that confirms the valley's reputation for genuine physical strangeness. And that in the end may be the most important thing about the underground dimension of this place. Not that it harbours something impossible, but that it harbours something genuinely unusual that science is still in the process of understanding. The valley floor is not transparent. What is beneath it matters, and the science that is trying to understand what is beneath it is still producing results that surprise the people doing the work. That scientific attention, the serious, instrument-based, peer-reviewed kind, has been accumulating in the San Luis Valley for decades, and it has produced findings that are, in their own way, as interesting as anything the researchers looking upward at the sky have documented. The geophysicists who study the Rio Grande Rift tend to describe their work with a kind of careful enthusiasm, the kind that comes from spending years measuring something that keeps producing results that are genuinely surprising. The rift beneath the San Luis Valley is not a passive geological feature. It is active. It is moving. The valley floor is very slowly and measurably sinking, while the mountain ranges on either side continue to rise. The rate is not dramatic in human terms. We're talking about fractions of millimeters per year. But over geological time, this motion has produced one of the most structurally unusual landscapes in North America. The Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, known as IRIS, has maintained seismic monitoring stations in and around the valley for years, and the data they have collected paints a picture of a valley floor that is far more active, acoustically and seismically, than its quiet surface would suggest. What that monitoring has detected, among other things, is a consistent pattern of very low-frequency seismic events. Small, often unfelt by humans, but measurable. These events are not earthquakes in the conventional sense. They are more like the rift breathing, small adjustments in the stress distribution of the crust as it continues its slow process of pulling apart. The valley sits on top of this, and the basin itself, its shape, its depth, its sediment fill, acts as a kind of resonance chamber for the energy these events produce. Sound, including sound well below the range of human hearing, behaves differently inside a closed basin than it does in open terrain. It reflects, it accumulates. It can travel long distances along the valley floor with relatively little attenuation. This is not speculation. It is basic acoustics applied to a specific geological setting. The frequency range involved is what makes it particularly interesting. Infrasound, sound waves below roughly 20 Hz, the lower threshold of normal human hearing, is produced by a range of natural sources. Severe weather, ocean waves, volcanic activity, and tectonic stress can all generate infrasound. The San Luis Valley, with its active rift, its closed basin geometry, and its tendency toward dramatic atmospheric events, is a reasonably productive natural source of infrasound. And infrasound, it turns out, is not something humans simply fail to notice. Research going back to the 1970s and expanded significantly in the 1990s and 2000s has shown that infrasound at certain frequencies, particularly around 18 to 19 Hz, can produce a range of physiological and psychological effects in people who are exposed to it. These effects include a vague but persistent sense of unease, feelings of being watched, visual disturbances at the edges of perception, in some cases, mild disorientation, or what researchers have described as a feeling that something is present in the room or in the environment that cannot be identified. The neuroscientist Vic Tandy, working at Coventry University in the late 1990s, documented a case in which infrasound at approximately 18.98 Hz was causing laboratory workers to experience anxiety, peripheral visual disturbances, and a general sense that something was wrong in their workspace. When the source, a fan, was identified and the infrasound eliminated, the experiences stopped. Tandy's work was peer-reviewed and published, and it opened a line of inquiry that has continued since. How much of what people describe as anomalous perceptual experience in certain locations might be attributable to infrasound produced by the environment itself? This is not a complete explanation for everything people report in the San Luis Valley. It would be an overclaim to say that infrasound accounts for the cattle mutilations, or the specific structured craft that witnesses have described, or the lights that appear to enter and exit the ground near Blanca Peak. But it is a plausible partial explanation for a specific category of experience: the feeling of wrongness, the sense of presence, the vague dread that many people describe when they are out on the valley floor at night, in the open, far from any town. The valley produces that feeling reliably enough that it has become part of the place's reputation, and if the valley's geology is generating infrasound consistently, which the seismic data suggests is at least possible, then that feeling may have a physical cause that has nothing to do with the paranormal and everything to do with the way the earth moves beneath your feet in this particular place. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist at Laurentian University in Ontario, spent decades developing a related but distinct hypothesis. Persinger's work focused on the relationship between tectonic strain, the stress that builds in rock as geological forces act on it, and the electromagnetic fields that this strain can generate. His proposal, sometimes called the tectonic strain theory, suggested that piezoelectric effects in stressed rock could produce localized electromagnetic anomalies capable of causing unusual perceptual experiences in people who are nearby. In some versions of the theory, these effects could also produce visible light phenomena, plasma formations, luminous balls, or structured lights that would be real physical events but would have a geological rather than extraterrestrial origin. Persinger's work was controversial, and some of his more specific experimental claims, particularly around his so-called God helmet, a device designed to apply weak magnetic fields to the temporal lobes, have not replicated consistently. The scientific community's response to his broader body of work has been mixed, but the core idea that geological stress can produce electromagnetic effects and that those effects can influence human perception is not fringe science. It is a hypothesis that serious researchers have taken seriously, and the San Luis Valley, with its active rift and its documented magnetic anomalies, is exactly the kind of geological setting where such effects, if they exist, would be most likely to appear. The USGS has documented magnetic anomalies in the valley floor, areas where the local magnetic field deviates from what would be expected based on the surrounding terrain. These anomalies are real and measured. Their cause is the geology, the rift, the volcanic history of the region, the composition of the sediment and bedrock beneath the valley floor. Whether these anomalies are strong enough or consistent enough to produce the kinds of perceptual effects Persinger described is not established, but the anomalies are there, and they are another piece of the valley's genuinely unusual physical profile. The atmosphere above the valley adds its own layer of documented strangeness. The San Luis Valley experiences some of the most extreme temperature swings in the continental United States. It is not unusual for the temperature to drop 60 degrees Fahrenheit between a summer afternoon and the following morning. The valley floor can be in the 90s in the early afternoon and below freezing by dawn. This is partly a function of elevation. At 7,500 feet, the air is thin enough that it loses heat rapidly after sunset, and partly a function of the basin geometry, which traps cold air against the floor while warmer air sits above it. The result is a persistent phenomenon called a temperature inversion, where the normal atmospheric layering is reversed. Cold air below, warm air above. Temperature inversions are well known to atmospheric scientists, and one of their documented effects is the bending of light. When light passes through layers of air at significantly different temperatures, it refracts. It bends. The bending can be dramatic enough to produce mirages, to make objects appear to be in locations they are not, to make distant lights appear to hover, to elongate or distort the apparent shape of light sources. The San Luis Valley's extreme temperature swings mean that inversion layers are not occasional events here. They are a regular feature of the valley's atmosphere, particularly at night and in the early morning hours. This is relevant because many of the valley's most frequently reported UFO sightings happen at night, when the inversion layers are most pronounced. This does not mean that every light seen in the San Luis Valley sky is a mirage of a distant car or a refracted star. Some of the reports involve objects at close range moving in ways that refraction cannot account for, observed by multiple witnesses who are close enough to see structural detail. But it does mean that the valley's atmosphere is, by its own documented physics, a place where lights behave unusually, where distant objects can appear to be overhead, where the sky itself is less reliable as a reference frame than it would be at lower elevations or in less topographically enclosed terrain. The atmosphere is doing something real, and some of what people see is probably that real atmospheric effect rather than anything else. Ball lightning is another phenomenon worth mentioning in this context. Ball lightning, luminous, roughly spherical plasma formations that can persist for seconds or sometimes minutes, and move in ways that seem inconsistent with simple electrical discharge, has been documented in the scientific literature, though its mechanism is still not fully understood. It tends to occur in areas with active electrical storms, which the San Luis Valley has in abundance during its summer monsoon season. Reports of ball lightning from the valley are consistent with what is documented elsewhere. Glowing spheres, various colours, moving at low altitude, sometimes appearing to follow terrain features, disappearing without obvious cause. Some of what gets reported as anomalous lights in the valley is probably ball lightning. Not all of it, but some. What is genuinely interesting about the scientific picture of the San Luis Valley is not that science has explained everything. It has not. The cattle mutilations remain genuinely difficult to account for through predation alone, and the specific physical details, the clean excisions, the absence of blood, the missing organs, have not been satisfactorily explained by any mechanism that is fully established. Some of the structured craft sightings involve enough specific detail and enough independent witnesses that dismissing them as misidentified conventional objects or atmospheric effects requires a degree of confidence that the evidence does not entirely support. There are things in the record of this valley that remain genuinely open questions, but what science has done is establish that the valley is, in physical terms, a genuinely unusual place. The rift is real. The aquifer is real. The magnetic anomalies are real. The infrasound potential is real. The inversion layers are real and extreme. The atmospheric electricity during storm season is real and intense. The seismic activity, low level and persistent, is real. Any one of these features would make a landscape somewhat unusual. The San Luis Valley has all of them, concentrated in a closed basin at high elevation, surrounded by mountain ranges that amplify and contain whatever the valley produces. The physical environment here is not like most places. That is not a mystical claim. It is a geological and atmospheric one, supported by decades of instrument-based measurement. What makes this interesting, and what the scientific picture does not fully resolve, is the question of whether the valley's unusual physical properties are sufficient to explain its unusual reputation, or whether the physical properties are part of the explanation, but not all of it. The infrasound and the inversion layers and the magnetic anomalies can account for some categories of experience. They cannot account for all of them, and the gap between what the instruments can explain and what the witnesses have reported is not nothing. It is a real gap, and honest researchers in the physical sciences who have worked in the valley tend to acknowledge it, even if they are careful about what they say in peer-reviewed contexts. The valley has a way of doing this, of producing a scientific picture that is genuinely interesting and genuinely strange, and then leaving a remainder that the science has not yet reached. The geophysicists who come here to study the rift find the rift fascinating and strange enough on its own terms. The atmospheric scientists who come to study the inversion layers and the temperature extremes find the valley's atmosphere to be a remarkable natural laboratory. The hydrologists who study the aquifer find the closed basin hydrology to be one of the more unusual water systems in the American West. Each of these researchers is working on something real, something measurable, something that produces results that matter for their field. And each of them is also working in a place where the locals have stories, where the sky behaves unusually, where the ground produces sounds and electromagnetic fields that the instruments can detect, but that the full implications of are still being worked out. Science has not closed the book on the San Luis Valley. It has opened several chapters and left them in progress. The rift study is ongoing. The aquifer is still being mapped and modelled. The atmospheric research continues. The infrasound question, as it applies to anomalous human perception in specific geological settings, is still an active area of inquiry. The valley is not a place where the scientific investigation has reached a settled conclusion. It is a place where the investigation is still producing new data, and where some of that data is, by the standards of the relevant disciplines, genuinely surprising. That ongoing quality, the sense that the valley is still being understood, that the instruments are still finding things, that the models are still being revised, is part of what keeps the San Luis Valley interesting beyond its folklore. The folklore is colourful and durable and worth taking seriously as a record of human experience in an unusual place. But the science is also unfinished, and an unfinished scientific picture of a physically strange landscape is, in its own way, as compelling as any legend. The two run alongside each other here, the documented and the unexplained, and neither one has yet managed to fully account for the other. And the valley, for its part, continues to produce phenomena that keep both the folklore and the science in motion. The water beneath the surface moves in ways that are still being modelled. The rift continues its slow work. The atmosphere above the floor continues its temperature extremes and its inversions and its electrical storms. Whatever the valley is doing, it has not stopped, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it from a scientific standpoint. This is a place that is still actively happening, in geological and atmospheric terms, and the full consequences of what it is doing are not yet fully understood. That understanding, or the ongoing attempt at it, connects in a perhaps unexpected way to one of the valley's most visible and most quietly strange features. The water itself, not the hidden water of the aquifer, but the water that moves across the surface in ways that have surprised every visitor who has encountered it for the first time without knowing what to expect. Medano Creek is not a famous river. It does not appear on most maps of the American West in any prominent way. It is short, seasonal, and shallow, barely a creek by the standards of most places. But if you walk along the base of the Great Sand Dunes in late spring or early summer, when the snowmelt from the Sangre de Cristo Range is still feeding it, you will see something that stops most people in their tracks the first time they encounter it, without prior warning. The creek pulses, not metaphorically, not in the way that rivers surge during floods or taper during drought. Medano Creek pulses in rhythmic waves, regular and repeating, every 20 to 30 seconds, like something breathing. A wave of water will move down the creek bed, visibly higher than the flow around it, washing over your feet if you're standing in the shallows, and then it passes, and the water drops back, and then another wave comes, and another. The interval is not perfectly metronomic, but it is close enough to feel intentional, and the first time you see it, the instinct is to look around for whatever is causing it, because it does not look like a natural thing. It looks like something is pushing the water from upstream, deliberately and repeatedly. The phenomenon has a name. It is called surge flow, and the mechanism behind it is genuinely interesting once you understand it. The stream bed of Medano Creek is sand, deep, fine, highly mobile sand from the dunes themselves. As water flows over this sand, it moves the grains and builds up small underwater dams, little ridges of sand that accumulate across the stream bed until the water pressure behind them is enough to collapse them. When they collapse, the water that was held back surges forward as a wave. Then the process begins again. New sand accumulates, a new ridge forms, pressure builds, the ridge collapses, another wave, over and over, every few seconds, all down the length of the creek. It is a hydrological phenomenon that is documented in a handful of places around the world, but it is rare enough that most people who study rivers never see it in person. The conditions required are specific: a loose, sandy stream bed, a relatively shallow and steady flow, and the right relationship between the water's energy and the sand's mobility. The dunes provide all of these conditions simultaneously, which is why Medano Creek is one of the more reliable places in the world to observe surge flow in action. The National Park Service, which manages the Great Sand Dunes, has documentation of the phenomenon and even describes it in visitor materials. It is real, it is measured, it is understood in terms of its mechanism, and it still looks every single time like something that should not be happening. That quality of being simultaneously explainable and visually impossible is something the valley returns to again and again. You find the mechanism, you understand it, and then you watch the thing happen, and the explanation does not fully dissolve the strangeness. The creek pulses and you know why, and it still looks like breathing. The water story in the San Luis Valley is larger than one creek, though. The hydrology of the entire valley is unusual in ways that go beyond the visual drama of surge flow. The valley is what hydrologists call a closed basin, which means that water enters the valley through precipitation and snowmelt, flows down from the surrounding mountains, and then has essentially nowhere to go. There is no outlet river carrying the valley's water to the ocean. The Rio Grande runs through the valley, yes, and it does carry some water southward toward New Mexico, and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. But the Rio Grande does not drain the valley the way a river drains a normal watershed. Much of the water that falls on the valley floor and flows down from the mountain simply sinks into the ground, recharging the massive aquifer system that sits beneath the surface. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In most landscapes, water has a clear direction. It falls, it collects, it flows downhill toward a river, the river carries it to the sea. The water moves through the landscape and eventually leaves it. In the San Luis Valley, much of the water does not leave. It enters and stays, sinking into the ground and joining a body of water that is in some places thousands of feet deep and that has been accumulating for a very long time. The valley is, in a sense, collecting water, holding it. The surface looks dry. Much of the valley floor is sagebrush and scrub and cracked alkali flats. But beneath that dry surface is one of the largest reserves of fresh water in the western United States. The aquifer system actually has two distinct layers. The upper unconfined aquifer is the shallower one, more directly connected to the surface, more responsive to rainfall and seasonal changes. The lower confined aquifer is much deeper, much older, and separated from the upper layer by a thick band of clay. The water in the confined aquifer has been there in some cases for tens of thousands of years. It is under pressure from the weight of the material above it, and in places where the confining clay layer is breached, by a well or by a natural geological feature, the water can rise to the surface on its own without being pumped. These are artesian conditions, and the San Luis Valley has them in several locations. Springs that appear to push water upward without any obvious source, water rising from the ground in a place that looks like it should be dry. The Baca Aquifer, which sits beneath the Baca Grande property near Crestone, is one of the more significant concentrations of this deep water. It has been the subject of considerable legal and political attention over the decades, because water in the American West is not just a physical resource, it is a legal one, with complicated systems of rights and priorities that determine who can use it and how. The ownership of the Baca Grande property changed hands multiple times over the 20th century, partly because of the land's surface features and partly because of what was known to be beneath it. In 2004, the federal government purchased the Baca Grande property, and it became the Valle Caldera National Preserve and the Baca National Wildlife Refuge, protecting both the surface and the water beneath it. The aquifer is now in some sense a public resource, though the full extent of what it contains is still being mapped. Historical accounts from the valley's earlier settlers describe springs appearing and disappearing across the valley floor in ways that seemed unpredictable. A spring that was reliable for a decade might dry up after a hard winter. A patch of ground that had always been dry might begin seeping water after a wet summer. The hydrology of the valley floor is not static. It shifts in response to recharge from the mountains, to the seasonal behaviour of the Rio Grande, and to longer-term changes in precipitation patterns that operate on timescales of years and decades. Early settlers who did not have the framework of aquifer science to explain what they were seeing sometimes described the valley floor as alive in some way, as if the ground itself was breathing or responding. Which is, in a loose sense, not entirely wrong. The surface expression of the aquifer does change, and those changes are visible if you're paying attention over long periods of time. The Closed Basin Project is a federal water management effort that has been operating in the valley since the 1970s. The project involves pumping groundwater from the northern part of the valley and transferring it into the Rio Grande, primarily to help Colorado meet its water delivery obligations under the Rio Grande Compact, an agreement between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas that governs how much water each state is entitled to from the river. The project has pumped hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water over the decades. It is, in practical terms, a way of moving the valley's hidden water into the visible river system, making it countable and transferable. The machinery involved, the wells, the pumps, the canals, is industrial and unglamorous, scattered across the northern valley floor in a way that most visitors never notice. But the scale of the operation is a reminder of just how much water is down there, and of how much effort it takes to manage a closed basin in a region where water rights are legally and politically contested. The relationship between the aquifer and the valley's other unusual properties is something that researchers have noted without fully resolving. The confined aquifer, under pressure, creates conditions in the subsurface that are different from what you find in most landscapes. Water under pressure in porous rock can generate piezoelectric effects, the same basic principle that makes certain crystals produce a small electrical charge when compressed. The geology of the valley floor, with its mix of sedimentary layers, volcanic material from the ancient rift activity, and the enormous weight of the water-bearing formations, creates conditions where low-level electromagnetic activity in the subsurface is plausible. This is speculative in terms of the specific magnitudes involved. No one has published a study definitively measuring piezoelectric output from the San Luis Valley aquifer and connecting it to surface phenomena. But the physical conditions that would be required for such effects are present, and the USGS has documented magnetic anomalies in the valley floor that are consistent with unusual subsurface electromagnetic activity. The acoustic properties of the valley are connected to the water as well, in a more direct way. The confined aquifer, because it is saturated and under pressure, transmits sound differently than dry rock. Infrasound, Those low-frequency waves below the threshold of human hearing can travel through saturated sediment more efficiently than through dry material, and the valley's water-saturated subsurface may act as a kind of waveguide, channeling infrasound generated by the rift's seismic activity across the valley floor in ways that are difficult to predict from the surface. The valley's shape, a broad flat basin surrounded by mountain walls, already creates conditions for infrasound resonance. Add the acoustic properties of the aquifer beneath the surface, and you have a system where low-frequency sound is being generated, channeled, and concentrated in ways that instruments can detect, but that the full implications of are still being worked out. People who spend time on the valley floor at night sometimes describe a feeling that is difficult to articulate, a sense of pressure, or of being watched, or of something just below the threshold of perception. Some of this is almost certainly the ordinary strangeness of being in a very dark, very quiet, very flat place under an enormous sky. The human nervous system is not designed for that kind of exposure, and the absence of visual reference points and ambient sound can produce its own kind of unease. But some of it may be infrasound. The feeling of unease that infrasound produces in human subjects, documented in controlled studies, is often described in exactly these terms: a vague pressure, a sense of presence, a mild but persistent discomfort that has no obvious cause. Whether the valley's infrasound levels are high enough in specific locations to produce these effects in people who are simply standing on the valley floor is not something that has been measured with enough precision to say definitively. But the conditions for it are there. Medano Creek, in its own small way, is a kind of summary of the valley's water story. It is surface water, visible and touchable, doing something strange that turns out to have a real explanation. The aquifer is hidden water, enormous and old, doing things that are still being mapped and modelled. The springs that appear and disappear are the conversation between the two layers, the surface and the deep, playing out over years and decades. The Rio Grande running through the middle of it all is water that passes through without really belonging to the valley. A visitor, in hydrological terms, moving through a system that is mostly concerned with holding rather than releasing. The valley keeps its water the way it keeps its stories, not easily surrendered, not fully explained, present in ways that you can measure and document, and then present in additional ways that the measurements have not yet fully accounted for. The water that sinks into the ground here has been sinking for a very long time, and what it has done to the landscape, to the acoustics, to the electromagnetic environment, to the slow chemistry of the rock, is still being understood. It is part of what makes this valley physically unusual in ways that go beyond folklore, in ways that serious scientists find genuinely interesting, and that the data continues to complicate and deepen. All of this, the pulsing creek, the hidden aquifer, the disappearing springs, the electromagnetic whisper of pressurized water and fractured rock, sits beneath a landscape that has also produced something else entirely. Reports of animals, large and unidentified, seen moving across the valley floor and along its margins, in ways that the valley's known wildlife does not quite account for. The valley's wildlife history is, on its own, worth spending a moment with before getting into the stranger reports. The San Luis Valley sits within one of the more ecologically significant corridors in the American West. The Rio Grande runs through it. The wetlands around Monte Vista and Alamosa support enormous populations of migratory birds. Sandhill cranes in particular, tens of thousands of them, arriving each February and March in numbers that are genuinely difficult to comprehend if you have not seen it. The sky above the Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge during crane migration can be almost entirely bird, a moving ceiling of grey wings and calling voices that fills the air in every direction. This is documented, photographed, studied. It is one of the great wildlife spectacles in North America, and most people outside Colorado have never heard of it. The valley also has mountain lions, black bears, coyotes, elk, pronghorn antelope, and historically had wolves before the 20th century extirpation campaigns removed them from the region. Mexican grey wolf reintroduction efforts in the broader region have brought occasional confirmed sightings back into the southern parts of the valley in recent years, which is relevant to some of the creature reports. The point is that the valley is not ecologically empty. It has a real and documented wildlife community, and any honest account of unusual animal reports has to hold that baseline clearly in view. With that said, the reports that fall outside the baseline are worth examining on their own terms. The most persistent category involves large, dark-coloured animals seen at the margins of the valley, along the base of the dunes near the Rio Grande corridor, and in the scrubland between Alamosa and the New Mexico border. Some of these reports describe what sounds straightforwardly like a mountain lion, which is a real and present animal in the region. Mountain lions are large, can appear very dark in low light, and move in ways that seem wrong to people who have not seen one before. Too fluid, too quiet, too big. A significant number of the large predator sightings in the valley almost certainly fall into this category. Real animals, misidentified or exaggerated in the retelling. But there is a subset of reports that does not resolve as cleanly. Christopher O'Brien, who spent years collecting accounts from valley residents, documented multiple reports of a large black animal that witnesses described as distinctly feline but larger than any mountain lion on record, some accounts placing the shoulder height at close to 4 feet, which would be roughly double what a large mountain lion typically stands. O'Brien was careful to note that witness estimates of animal size are notoriously unreliable, particularly in low light and open terrain where there is little for scale. He did not claim these reports as confirmed evidence of an unknown species, but he documented them because they kept appearing from different witnesses in different years in overlapping geographic areas. The 1993 report near Monte Vista is one of the more specific ones. A rancher, whose name O'Brien recorded but did not publish without permission, described encountering a large animal on a dirt road at night, caught briefly in headlights. The rancher had lived in the valley for decades and was familiar with mountain lions, black bears, and the other large predators of the region. He said this was none of those things. The animal was described as black, heavily muscled through the shoulders, with a head that seemed too large relative to the body, and it moved off the road in a single motion that the rancher found difficult to describe. Not a leap, not a run, something in between that covered ground very quickly. O'Brien investigated the location and found no tracks, which he noted could be explained by the dry, hard-packed soil of the road margin. There was nothing physical to examine. The report exists as a witness account and nothing more. What makes it interesting is not that it proves anything. It does not. What makes it interesting is that it fits a pattern that shows up across the broader region. Similar descriptions, similar locations, similar circumstances of low light and open ground. The pattern could reflect a real but unidentified animal. It could reflect a known animal, probably a mountain lion, being consistently misidentified in conditions that distort perception. It could reflect the way that stories accumulate in places that already have a reputation for strangeness, where witnesses are perhaps more likely to interpret ambiguous experiences as something unusual. All three of those explanations are plausible, and the available evidence does not decisively favour one over the others. The Skinwalker Ranch comparison gets made sometimes, usually by outside writers who are drawing a broader map of American anomaly zones. The Uinta Basin in Utah, where Skinwalker Ranch sits, shares some surface features with the San Luis Valley. A remote high-altitude basin, a history of cattle mutilation reports, unusual electromagnetic readings, and a concentration of anomalous claims that spans multiple categories rather than staying within one. The comparison is not entirely wrong as a structural observation. Both places seem to accumulate strangeness across different domains simultaneously, which is part of what makes them harder to dismiss than a single category mystery. But the San Luis Valley has a much longer and better documented human history, a more complex geological profile, and a larger body of serious scientific attention. It is its own thing. The bird behaviour reports are a smaller category but an interesting one. The valley is, as mentioned, a major migratory corridor, and the presence of large numbers of disoriented or stranded birds is not inherently unusual. Birds get confused by weather, by light pollution, by magnetic disruptions, and by simple exhaustion during long migrations. But there are accounts from near the dunes specifically that describe birds behaving in ways that even experienced birders found difficult to explain. Mass groundings, where large numbers of birds land and do not leave, have been reported near the dune field on several occasions. Whether this is related to the dune's unusual microclimate, the temperature differentials, the updrafts, the way the sand and the mountain wall interact to create local atmospheric conditions that differ significantly from the surrounding valley, or to something else is not established. The dunes create their own weather in small ways, and birds navigating by air pressure and thermal gradients could plausibly be affected by the dune field's local atmospheric signature. That is a reasonable mundane explanation. It may be the correct one. The documented presence of black bears at unusual elevations and locations in the valley is worth a brief note, because it occasionally feeds into the larger creature reports. Black bears in the San Luis Valley are not rare, but they tend to stay in the forested mountain margins rather than crossing the open valley floor. When they do cross, which they do, occasionally following the river corridor or moving between mountain ranges, they can appear in places and contexts that seem wrong to observers who are not expecting them. A black bear seen at distance, crossing a flat open landscape at dusk, can look very strange. The silhouette is unfamiliar, the movement is distinctive, and the size is easy to misjudge without reference points. Some of the large dark animal reports from the valley floor almost certainly have this explanation. A bear in the wrong place, seen by someone who was not expecting a bear, at a time of day when the light was uncertain. This is not a dismissal. It is just an honest accounting of how these things work. The valley's wildlife is real and present and sometimes genuinely surprising, and the line between a documented animal doing something unexpected and an unidentified creature doing something impossible is a line that requires careful attention to evidence rather than enthusiasm for either conclusion. The mutilation phenomenon, which was covered earlier, connects to the creature reports in one specific way that is worth noting here. One of the persistent questions about the mutilations, the surgical precision, the absence of blood, the specific pattern of removed organs, is whether a known predator or scavenger could account for the physical evidence. The natural predation explanation, which was the conclusion of Kenneth Rommel's 1979 Department of Justice investigation, relies on specific mechanisms: blowfly larvae liquefying soft tissue, small predators removing eyes and lips and tongues, because those are the softest and most accessible parts, decomposition creating what looks like clean incisions. These are real mechanisms, they do happen. But the ranchers and independent investigators who rejected that explanation were not simply being credulous. They were pointing to specific physical details that the natural predation model has difficulty accounting for, including the absence of blood in the surrounding soil and the reported cauterized appearance of some wound edges, which decomposition and scavenging do not typically produce. If the mutilations are not entirely explained by natural predation, then something else is involved. That something else does not have to be extraterrestrial, and it does not have to be a known predator. There have been suggestions of human involvement, cult activity, military experimentation, deliberate provocation for unknown purposes, none of which have been proven. The honest answer is that the physical evidence from the best documented cases is genuinely difficult to account for with a single clean explanation, and the creature reports from the same geographic areas during the same time periods add a layer of context that is uncomfortable to ignore entirely, even if it does not resolve anything. What the valley seems to do, and has done for a long time, is generate reports that sit just outside the edge of what the available explanations can fully contain. Not dramatically outside, not in ways that require abandoning all known biology or physics. just slightly outside in ways that leave a residue of genuine uncertainty that serious investigators find frustrating and interesting in equal measure. The migratory corridor aspect of the valley's ecology is worth returning to for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual and not well known. The valley sits between two major mountain ranges, and that funnel geography means that animals moving north and south through the region are channeled through a relatively narrow corridor. This is true for birds, but it is also true for larger mammals. Elk, mule deer, pronghorn, and historically bison all moved through the valley in large numbers. The predator populations that followed those prey animals were correspondingly large. The valley's current wildlife community is a diminished version of what was here 2 centuries ago, and the reports of large unusual animals may in some cases be encounters with animals whose populations are recovering or whose range is shifting in ways that wildlife management data has not yet fully captured. Mexican grey wolves, as mentioned, are beginning to reappear in the region. Mountain lion populations in the west have been expanding. The ecology of the valley is not static, and what is unusual today may be documented and ordinary in 20 years. That is a hopeful and scientifically grounded possibility. It sits alongside the less resolvable reports without cancelling them out. One of the things that makes the San Luis Valley genuinely different from places that simply have a reputation for strangeness is that the strangeness here tends to be specific. Witnesses give locations, dates, physical descriptions. Investigators find some of those locations and find things, or find nothing, which is itself a kind of data point. The reports are not uniformly vague. They are often frustratingly concrete, detailed enough to be taken seriously and examined carefully, and then frustratingly incomplete, stopping just short of the kind of evidence that would settle the question one way or the other. That pattern, specific, detailed, and ultimately unresolved, is consistent across the cattle mutilations, the aerial sightings, the underground theories, and the creature reports. The valley does not deal in easy mysteries or easy explanations. What it does deal in is a kind of accumulated weight. 11,000 years of human presence in a place that is geologically active, hydrologically unusual, atmospherically strange, and ecologically significant. That is a long time for a landscape to accumulate reports, and the valley has used every one of those years. The creature accounts are one thread in that accumulation, not the most dramatic, not the most documented, but persistent and specific enough that they belong in any honest account of what the valley has produced. And they are, in their own way, connected to everything else. The same landscape that produces infrasound from a rifting continental plate and piezoelectric whispers from a pressurized aquifer is also the landscape where a rancher saw something on a dirt road at night and could not find words for it afterward. Whether those things are connected in any causal way is not established, but they share a geography and they share a history, and the valley holds them all with the same flat, patient silence. The strangeness of the San Luis Valley is not concentrated in any one category. It spreads across the geology, the atmosphere, the water, the wildlife, and the long human record of experience in this place. Each category has its own texture, its own evidence, its own proportion of the explained and the unexplained. The creature reports are, taken individually, among the least dramatic of the valley's mysteries, but taken together with everything else, they are part of a picture of a place where the ordinary and the unaccounted for have been living in close proximity for a very long time. The valley's strangeness seems to concentrate in certain locations more than others, and understanding where those concentrations appear and why requires looking at the people who actually live here, not just the investigators who come and go. There are roughly 46,000 people living in the San Luis Valley. Spread that number across an area larger than the state of Connecticut, and you begin to understand what daily life there actually feels like. Not crowded, not busy, not the kind of place where you run into people at the grocery store and think nothing of it. You notice people here. You know which trucks belong to which families. You learn the rhythms of the roads because the roads are yours in a way that roads in cities never are. The main population centre is Alamosa, sitting near the middle of the valley floor with around 10,000 people. It has a university, Adams State, a few chain restaurants, a hospital, the usual infrastructure of a small regional hub. Monte Vista is nearby, a little smaller, known for the Monte Vista National Wildlife Refuge and the sandhill crane migration that brings tens of thousands of birds through the valley each spring, a spectacle that is genuinely one of the more remarkable wildlife events in the American West, and that most people outside the region have never heard of. Saguache sits to the north, quieter, older feeling. Center is a small agricultural town that produces a meaningful share of the nation's potato crop. And then there is Crestone, which we have already visited, sitting apart from all of it at the mountain's edge, doing its own thing entirely. The economy here is built on agriculture and ranching primarily. The valley's potato industry is not a minor footnote. The San Luis Valley produces somewhere between 15 and 20% of the United States' total potato supply in a typical year, which is a remarkable figure for a high-altitude desert basin that receives less than 8 inches of rain annually. The irrigation infrastructure is extensive, drawing from that enormous aquifer beneath the valley floor, and the fields in summer are a vivid, almost startling green against the surrounding tan and brown of the unirrigated land. There is something quietly surreal about driving past a pivot irrigator, throwing water in a slow circle over a potato field while the great sand dunes rise in the background. The valley manages to make the agricultural and the otherworldly coexist in the same visual frame without either cancelling the other out. Ranching has been here longer than the potato industry, and the ranching families tend to be the ones with the deepest roots in the valley, some of them descendants of the original Spanish land-grant settlers, families that have been working the same land for 5 or 6 generations. These are not people who are easily impressed, and they are not people who tend to volunteer their strange experiences to outsiders. Many of them are pragmatic to the point of being almost dismissive about the valley's reputation. They have heard the UFO stories. They know the investigators come through. They have seen the documentaries that use their landscape as a backdrop for speculation. And a lot of them are, frankly, tired of it. What is interesting, though, is what happens when you talk to those same ranching families over a longer period of time in a less formal context. Christopher O'Brien documented this in his years of fieldwork in the valley. The pattern where a rancher who was sceptical and a little impatient in an initial conversation would, later, over coffee or across a fence, mention something quietly. A light they saw over the north pasture 3 winters ago. A calf found in a way that did not make sense and that they never reported because they did not want the attention. A sound they heard at 2 in the morning that they still cannot account for. These are not people performing strangeness for an audience. They are people who have their own experiences and who are selective about when and to whom they share them, which is a reasonable response to living in a place where outside interest tends to arrive with preloaded conclusions. The skepticism of long-time valley residents is not the same as the absence of experience. It is more like a protective layer over experience, a way of holding what they know without inviting the circus that tends to follow public disclosure. That distinction matters when you're trying to understand what the valley is actually like to live in, versus what it looks like from the outside. Driving across the valley floor at night is its own particular experience, and it is worth describing carefully because it is one of those things that is difficult to convey without having done it. The valley is very flat and very wide, and at night the mountains on both sides disappear entirely into the dark. You lose the sense of being enclosed. The sky becomes the dominant feature, not just big, but overwhelming in a way that is different from other dark sky locations, because the flatness of the valley floor means there is almost no horizon obstruction. Stars appear to come down to the ground on all sides. The Milky Way on a clear night is bright enough to cast a faint shadow. The road ahead of you is lit only by your headlights, and on the smaller county roads there are no other headlights for miles in any direction. The silence, When you stop and get out of the car is the kind of silence that has physical weight. You can hear your own heartbeat. You can hear the wind moving across the flat ground before it reaches you. For people who are not accustomed to that kind of darkness and silence, it can feel unsettling in a way that is hard to separate from the valley's reputation. When you know you're in a place where unusual things have been reported, the darkness reads differently. A light on the horizon that would be a passing truck anywhere else becomes something to watch carefully. A sound in the distance takes longer to dismiss. This is not irrational. Context genuinely changes perception, and the valley's accumulated history is part of the context that any visitor brings with them. Whether that means the valley produces more experiences because it produces more attention is a genuine question, and it is one that the valley's skeptical residents sometimes raise pointedly. But the valley's mental health statistics are worth mentioning here, because they add a dimension to the human experience of the place that tends to get left out of the mystery-focused accounts. The San Luis Valley consistently shows elevated rates of depression and anxiety compared to state and national averages. The reasons for this are almost certainly multiple and overlapping. Poverty is a significant factor. The valley has some of the highest poverty rates in Colorado, with median household incomes well below the state median. Isolation is another factor. Access to mental health services is limited. The winters are long and cold, and the agricultural economy has cycles of real hardship. These are not exotic explanations. They are the ordinary, difficult conditions of rural poverty in a remote region, and they shape daily life in ways that have nothing to do with the valley's reputation for strangeness. Whether the valley's unusual atmospheric and electromagnetic properties contribute in any way to psychological experience is a more speculative question. Michael Persinger's work on electromagnetic fields and anomalous perception, mentioned earlier in this account, is a serious scientific hypothesis, not a fringe claim, and the valley's documented geomagnetic anomalies are real. Infrasound, which the valley's shape and geology can generate, has been shown in controlled studies to produce feelings of unease, anxiety, and in some cases visual disturbances. Whether these mechanisms operate at levels and frequencies sufficient to affect the general population living in the valley is genuinely unknown. It is possible that they contribute something. It is also possible that the mental health statistics are entirely explained by socio-economic factors and have nothing to do with the valley's physical properties. The honest answer is that no one has done the research necessary to separate those variables, and in the absence of that research, the question stays open. What is clear is that the people who live here carry the valley's strangeness differently than the people who visit it. For visitors, the strangeness is the point. It is why they came. It is what they are looking for, and the valley tends to deliver something for almost everyone who arrives with that expectation. For residents, the strangeness is background. It is part of the landscape, like the dunes or the mountains or the cold. Some residents find it interesting. Some find it irritating. Some have had experiences they cannot explain and have simply filed those experiences away in the same mental category as other things in life that do not have clean answers. There is also a genuine community tension in the valley around how its reputation is used and by whom. The tourism economy has grown in recent years, and the Great Sand Dunes National Park draws around 500,000 visitors annually. Some of that tourism is straightforwardly nature-based. People come for the dunes, for the wildlife refuge, for the hot springs at Joyful Journey or Valley View. But a growing portion of the tourism is explicitly mystery-focused, drawn by the UFO reports, the cattle mutilation history, the Crestone spiritual communities, the general reputation of the place as somewhere unusual. There are tours, there are events, there are social media accounts dedicated to the valley's paranormal reputation. Some residents welcome this. It brings money into a struggling regional economy, and there is a genuine argument that the valley's unusual history is a legitimate cultural resource that deserves to be shared and explored. Others are less comfortable with it, particularly the ranching families who have been on the receiving end of investigators showing up unannounced on private property. or the indigenous communities for whom the valley's sacred sites are not tourist attractions and never have been. The Ute Mountain, Ute tribe and the Southern Ute Indian tribe have ongoing relationships with this landscape that predate every other presence here by thousands of years, and the framing of the valley as a mystery to be solved by outside investigators sits uncomfortably against that history. The tension between those who want to promote the valley's strangeness and those who simply want to live their lives in a complicated but ordinary place is not unique to the San Luis Valley. It appears in every location that develops a paranormal reputation, but it is worth naming clearly, because it is part of the human reality of the place, and any account of the valley that focuses only on the mysteries, without acknowledging the people who live among them, is missing something essential. What the long-term residents share, across their differences in perspective, is a relationship with the valley that has depth and texture that no short visit can replicate. They know where the roads flood in spring. They know which peaks hold snow longest. They know the particular quality of the light in late afternoon when the sun is low, and the mountains to the east go amber and then dark red, the colour that gave the Sangre de Cristo range its name, though the naming story is older and stranger than a simple observation of sunset. They know the valley in all its seasons and all its moods, and they carry that knowledge in a way that makes the visiting investigators, with their equipment and their expectations, seem like people who have read a book about a place and arrived expecting the book. The valley, for those who live in it, is not primarily a mystery. It is a home, a difficult one in many ways, economically precarious, geographically isolated, harsh in winter, prone to the particular loneliness of wide open spaces, but also genuinely beautiful, in a way that is not soft or comfortable, but has a kind of severity to it that people who love it tend to love very deeply. The flatness of the floor, the improbable dunes, the mountains that appear to change colour by the hour, the enormous sky, the silence that is not empty but full of something that is hard to name. And within that home, the unexplained things sit, not at the centre of daily life usually, more at the edges, a story told quietly, a memory not shared with strangers, a light seen once on a winter night that never quite resolved into anything familiar. The valley holds all of this, the potato fields and the ancient aquifer, the sandhill cranes and the mutilated cattle, the Tibetan monks at Creston and the ranching families in Costilla County, the graduate students at Adams State and the retired investigators who came for a visit 30 years ago and never left. The mundane and the inexplicable are not in separate categories here. They share the same valley floor, the same flat roads, the same enormous dark sky. That coexistence is, in the end, what makes the San Luis Valley different from places that simply have a reputation. The reputation here did not arrive from outside. It grew from the ground up, from 11,000 years of human experience in a place that has never quite behaved the way places are supposed to behave. The people who live here are not separate from the history. They are part of it, whether they want to be or not. And the valley holds all of them. The skeptics and the believers, the investigators and the pragmatists, the newcomers and the families who have been here since before Colorado was a state, with the same flat, patient, largely indifferent silence that it has always maintained. The valley holds all of this at the same time, without apparent effort and without resolution. And what it ultimately represents, what it means that a place can accumulate this much strangeness across this many categories over this many centuries, is a question that requires stepping back from the individual threads and looking at the whole picture, which is where this account has been heading all along. So what does it mean, finally, to hold all of this in one place? That is the question the San Luis Valley keeps asking quietly, without any particular urgency. It does not demand an answer. It has been here long enough to be patient about it. When you try to step back and look at the valley as a whole, not the cattle mutilation cases, not the UFO reports, not the aquifer, not Crestone, not Blanca Peak, but all of it together at once. What you notice first is how many different kinds of strangeness are present, and how they do not obviously connect to each other. A geologist studying the Rio Grande Rift and a rancher who found one of his cattle in a condition that still does not have a satisfying explanation are not describing the same phenomenon. A Tibetan monk at a retreat centre in Crestone and a climber who experienced equipment failure near the summit of Blanca Peak are not telling the same story. And yet they are all in the same valley, under the same sky, above the same enormous hidden reservoir of water. There is something worth sitting with in that fact, not because it proves anything, but because the accumulation itself is unusual, and unusual accumulations deserve at least a moment of honest attention. Most places have one thing, one local legend, one documented anomaly, one layer of historical strangeness that gets retold and embellished over time until it is more story than event. The San Luis Valley has dozens of things, across completely different categories, documented by completely different kinds of people with completely different motivations, spanning thousands of years. That is not normal. It does not mean the valley is haunted, or that there is an underground base, or that something is watching from behind the mountains. It means the valley is genuinely, verifiably unusual in ways that resist easy summary. Some of what has been reported here has straightforward explanations that simply require patience to work through. The atmospheric inversion layers that bend light over the flat valley floor can produce convincing mirages of objects that are not there, or distort the appearance of objects that are. The infrasound produced by the valley's geological structure, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing, generated by the movement of the rift and amplified by the shape of the basin, can cause feelings of unease, disorientation, and even visual disturbances in people who have no idea they are being affected. The valley's extreme temperature swings, sometimes 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit in a single day, create atmospheric conditions that are legitimately unusual and produce optical effects that are rarely seen in more temperate landscapes. These are real, documented phenomena. They do not explain everything, but they explain more than most people who visit with paranormal expectations are prepared to acknowledge. The cattle mutilation cases are harder to settle. Kenneth Rommel's 1979 report for the Department of Justice concluded that the cases he examined were the result of natural predation and scavenger activity, and there is genuine scientific support for the idea that certain scavengers, particularly blowflies and their larvae, can produce surprisingly clean, precise-looking wounds on animal carcasses in ways that seem surgical but are not. The absence of blood at a site can be explained by the pooling and absorption of blood into the soil. These are not unreasonable explanations. But some of the specific physical details reported in the most carefully documented cases, the apparent cauterization of tissue edges, the selective removal of specific organs with no surrounding damage, the complete absence of any tracks in soft ground around a large animal, have not been fully accounted for by the predator hypothesis, and the researchers who have examined the evidence most carefully tend to land somewhere between the two positions. Most cases probably natural, some cases genuinely unclear. What is interesting about the valley, though, is not just the individual mysteries. It is the way the valley seems to function as a kind of amplifier for whatever framework a person brings to it. Investigators who arrive convinced they will find evidence of extraterrestrial activity tend to find experiences that support that interpretation. Geologists who arrive expecting to find an interesting, but ultimately explainable rift system tend to find exactly that. Spiritual seekers who come to Crestone looking for a place of power tend to find it. Skeptics who come looking for mundane explanations tend to find those too. This is not unique to the San Luis Valley. Human perception is shaped by expectation everywhere, and we tend to find what we are looking for in most situations. But the valley seems to be unusually good at providing raw material for whatever story a person has already decided to tell. There is enough genuine strangeness here, spread across enough different categories, that almost any framework can find something to attach to. That is worth naming honestly, because it is a real feature of the place. The valley is not a blank screen onto which people project their fantasies. The strangeness is real, documented, and in many cases predates any modern interpretive framework. But the valley is also extraordinarily accommodating of interpretation, and that accommodation has produced a body of claims and counterclaims that is genuinely difficult to sort through. The serious and the speculative sit very close together here, sometimes within the same account, sometimes within the same paragraph of the same book. What has stayed consistent across all the different eras and all the different kinds of people who have passed through or stayed is the physical experience of the valley itself, the flatness, the scale, the way the mountains ring the basin like walls, making the sky above seem larger than it has any right to be. The silence, which is not the absence of sound, but a particular quality of quiet that people who have spent time in the valley tend to describe in similar terms. A silence that feels inhabited or attentive, or simply very old. Whether that quality is geological, psychological, or something else entirely, it is consistent enough across enough different accounts that it seems like a genuine feature of the place rather than a projection. The Ute people, who lived in this valley for centuries before any European arrived, understood it as a place of power, not in a vague decorative sense, but in a specific practical sense that shaped where they camped, where they held ceremonies, and how they moved through the landscape. The Navajo held Blanca Peak as one of the 4 sacred mountains that define the boundaries of their world. The Spanish colonizers, arriving in the late 16th and 17th centuries, named the mountains after the blood of Christ, a name that carries its own weight, whether you take it as religious imagery or as an attempt to place something familiar over something that felt, to those early travellers, genuinely otherworldly. Every culture that has come into sustained contact with this valley has developed a framework for its strangeness. The frameworks differ. The recognition of the strangeness does not. There is something in that continuity that feels significant, though it is hard to say exactly what it proves. It does not prove that the valley is supernatural. It proves that the valley has been consistently unusual to human perception across a very long span of time, and that human beings, across very different cultural and interpretive backgrounds, have responded to it with something more than indifference. The aquifer beneath the valley floor holds an estimated 2 billion acre-feet of water, an amount so large it is almost impossible to picture. That water has been accumulating for thousands of years in a closed basin that has no outlet to the sea. It sits beneath the potato fields and the dry alkali flats and the pale expanse of the dunes, invisible and enormous, pressing upward against the valley floor from below. The Rio Grande flows through the valley but does not drain it. The water that enters from snowmelt largely sinks. The valley keeps what it receives. There is a metaphor in that, if you want one. A place that accumulates rather than releases, that holds rather than lets go. Whether or not the aquifer has anything to do with the valley's electromagnetic properties, its acoustic behaviour, or its unusual concentration of reported anomalies, it is a fact of the place that shapes everything above it, from the agriculture to the hydrology to the very feel of the ground underfoot. 11,000 years ago, people stood near what is now the Great Sand Dunes and left behind fulsome points, carefully worked stone tools that tell us, in the quiet language of archaeology, that someone was here, paying attention, surviving in a landscape that was already strange. The dunes were there, the mountains were there, the aquifer was there. Whatever the valley was doing then, whatever it was producing in the way of lights, sounds, atmospheric effects, or simply the overwhelming experience of its scale, those people experienced it. We do not know what they made of it. We have the points and the silence. Since then, the valley has been home to Pueblo communities, to Ute bands, to Spanish settlers, to American ranching families, to Tibetan monks, to federal investigators, to retired researchers who came for a weekend and stayed for decades. All of them have added something to the record. All of them have taken something from the place as well. An experience, a story, a memory that did not resolve cleanly into anything familiar. The dunes at night are a particular kind of strange. During the day, they are magnificent in a way that is easy to photograph and share. Golden, enormous, improbable, sitting at the base of a mountain range in the middle of a high desert valley in a way that makes you check, briefly, whether you're reading the landscape correctly. But at night they go pale. The colour drains out of them and they become something closer to silver, or to the colour of old bone, rising out of the dark valley floor with the mountains invisible behind them. Medano Creek, which flows along their base in summer, is quiet in the dark. The surge flow, that strange rhythmic pulsing of the water, the creek breathing in and out every 20 or 30 seconds, continues whether anyone is watching or not. The stars overhead, at 7,500 feet with minimal light pollution in any direction, are not the stars you see from a city or a suburb. They are the actual stars, in something close to their full number, and the Milky Way is not a suggestion, but a structure, a band of light broad enough to cast a faint shadow. In that darkness, with the dunes pale ahead of you, and the mountains dark behind them, and the stars overhead, and the aquifer below, and the silence doing whatever it is that silence does here, it is not difficult to understand why this place has accumulated what it has. It is not difficult to understand why people have been trying to explain it for 11,000 years and have not quite managed. Some places are simply more than they appear to be on a map. Some places hold more than their physical dimensions suggest. The San Luis Valley is one of those places, and it has been one of those places for longer than anyone has been keeping records. That does not mean it is supernatural. It does not mean the explanations are hiding somewhere just out of reach, waiting to be found. It might simply mean that the valley is a place where the world is a little more legible than usual, where the geological forces that shape all landscapes are more visible, where the atmospheric effects that occur everywhere are more concentrated, where the long history of human experience in a strange place has left a record dense enough to take seriously. Or it might mean something else. The valley has not said. What it offers, to anyone willing to spend time with it, is not answers. It is the experience of a place that has been genuinely, persistently, carefully strange for a very long time, and that continues to be strange in ways that resist the frameworks we bring to it. That is rarer than it sounds. Most places, when you look closely enough, turn out to be explicable. The San Luis Valley looks back. If you have spent time in a place that felt like that, a place that seemed to hold more than it was showing, that left you with questions you could not quite formulate, that stayed with you longer than you expected, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Leave a comment, tell me where it was and what it felt like. These conversations are part of what makes this channel worth building, and your stories matter more than you might think. Thank you for spending this time in the San Luis Valley. Thank you for listening in the dark wherever you are tonight, whatever the hour, whatever the weather outside your window. If this felt worth your time, a like and a subscription go a long way, and they help more people find their way to these quiet corners of the world. Take care of yourself, sleep well, and the valley will be there, flat and patient and full of its particular silence, when morning comes.